Welcome, travelers. An ancient stone holds a heavy secret, waiting for a hand that does not yet know its own strength. In a land shrouded by mist and old magic, a single spark is destined to ignite the forge of a kingdom. Step closer, for the echoes of a crown's promise are calling from the silent woods. Chapter 1. The cliffs of Tintagel rose from the churning sea like the jagged teeth of a beast, black and slick, with the spray of a relentless Atlantic storm. Above, the sky was a bruised purple, choked by clouds that refused to let the moonlight touch the carnage below. The air did not smell of the ocean's brine. It reeked of wet iron, wood smoke, and the copper tang of spilled blood. This was the edge of the world, where the land gave way to the hungry water, and it was here that Uther Pendragon, the High King of Britain, had brought his army to die. He stood near the precipice, his cloak whipping violently in the gale, indifferent to the arrows that occasionally skittered against the stones near his boots. His gaze was fixed upward, locked onto the impregnable fortress perched atop the headland. Within those high walls lay the Duke of Cornwall, Gorlois, his enemy. But others' eyes did not hunt for the Duke. They sought the Lady Igraine. It was a madness that had taken him, a fever in the blood that no physician could bleed out. He had seen her but once at the Easter feast, pale and striking against the gray of the court. And since that moment, the dragon of Britain had burned with a lust so consuming it threatened to turn his kingdom to ash. He had demanded her. He had besieged her home. He had sent thousands of men to break themselves against the rocks of Cornwall, all for the want of a woman who belonged to another. "The walls will not hold much longer, my king," a captain shouted over the roar of the wind, his face smeared with mud. "But the narrow pass. We lose 10 men for every one of theirs." Uther did not turn. He waved the man away with a gauntleted hand. Steel would not win this night. He knew that now. The fortress was too high, the causeway too narrow. Desperation clawed at his throat, a physical pain that mirrored the ache in his loins. He needed a key that was not forged of metal. From the shadows of the standing stones behind the king, a figure emerged. He moved without sound, his footsteps leaving no imprint in the sodden earth. Merlin. The druid was not a man of courtly robes or grand staffs. He was a creature of the wild, wrapped in furs and leather, his hair matted like the roots of an ancient oak. His eyes held no warmth, only the cold, calculating depth of a deep well. "You bleed your army dry, Uther," Merlin said, his voice cutting through the storm as if the wind itself quieted to listen. "And for what?" "A moment of heat. I must have her," Uther growled, turning to face the druid. The king's face was gaunt, his eyes rimmed with red, the face of an addict denied his fix. "Name your price, wizard. Anything within my realm, just open the gates." Merlin watched him, unblinking. The druid saw the threads of fate that others ignored. He saw the rot in others' soul, but he also saw the necessity of what was to come. Britain was fractured, a collection of warring tribes in the dark ruins of Rome. It needed a symbol. It needed a king who was more than a man. "The price is not gold, nor land," Merlin said softly. "The price is the fruit of your union, the child you plant in her womb this night. You will give him to me." Uther hesitated only for the beat of a heart. In his lust-blinded state, the future was a distant, abstract ghost. The present was the only reality that mattered. "Done," Uther rasped. "Give me the night, take the child." The pact was sealed in the cold mist. Merlin stepped forward, his hands weaving patterns in the damp air. He spoke words that sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates, a language older than men, drawn from the earth's molten core. The air around Uther shimmered and warped. The king gasped, falling to his knees as his bones shifted. It was an agony of reshaping. His broad shoulders hunched, his jaw squared, his hair graying in an instant. The familiar weight of his own flesh melted away, replaced by the visage of his enemy. When the magic settled, Uther Pendragon was gone. Standing in the mud was the perfect likeness of Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall. "Go," Merlin whispered, pointing toward the castle. "The guards will see their master returning from the front. The gates will open. But remember, Uther, the dawn brings the truth, and the debt is eternal." Uther, now wearing the face of the man he intended to cuckold, mounted his horse. He rode up the steep, treacherous causeway, the storm cloaking his approach. The deception was absolute. The sentries on the wall cheered to see the Duke return alive from the fray. The heavy timber gates groaned open, welcoming the wolf into the fold. He strode through the stone corridors of Tintagel, his heart hammering against ribs that felt foreign to him. He pushed past confused servants, ignoring their questions about the battle, moving with a singular, predatory focus toward the bedchamber. Igraine was there, pacing by the fire, her face etched with worry for her husband. When the door opened, she turned, relief washing over her features. She saw Gorlois. She saw safety. She did not see the dragon's eyes burning behind the mask. She ran to him, and Uther caught her, not with the tenderness of a husband, but with the starving desperation of a conqueror. Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, the thunder masking any cries from within the keep. Far below on the battlefield, the real Gorlois lay dead in the mud, struck down by Uther's men, while his counterfeit claimed the prize in the tower. In the dark of that chamber, amidst the deceit and the stolen intimacy, a seed was planted. It was not born of love, but of bloodlust and dark magic. As the lightning illuminated the stone walls, a shadow seemed to lengthen across the floor, a shadow that would grow to cover all of Britain. The king had his pleasure, and Merlin had his prize. The once and future king was conceived in the heart of a lie. Chapter 2. The winds that battered the coast of Cornwall 9 months prior had returned, screaming against the stone battlements of Tintagel, like the ghosts of the men Uther had slaughtered to claim his prize. Inside the keep, the air was thick, heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the sour tang of sweat. The High King of Britain stood in the corner of the birthing chamber, his silhouette flickering in the erratic light of a single tallow candle. He was a man carved from granite, yet tonight his hands trembled. From the bed, a cry erupted, a sound of raw, animal agony that tore through the howling gale outside. Lady Igraine, pale as the winter moon, fought the war of creation. Her body arched, her knuckles white as she gripped the soaked linens. The midwives moved around her in a flurry of hushed anxiety, their hands stained red, their eyes darting toward the king who watched from the shadows. They knew the rumors. They knew the unnatural circumstances of this child's conception, the night the king wore a dead man's face. Then, silence. The wind seemed to hold its breath. A new sound pierced the gloom, the sharp, indignant wail of a newborn. "It is a son, my lord," the eldest midwife whispered, swaddling the infant in rough wool. "He is small, but he is strong." Uther stepped forward. He looked down at the child, the boy who had cost him his honor and his soul. He reached out a finger, and the infant's tiny hand gripped it with surprising force. For a fleeting second, Uther felt a surge of pride, the fierce protectiveness of a father. But that warmth was instantly extinguished by the chilling drop in temperature within the room. The candle flame turned blue and died, plunging the chamber into gray twilight. The heavy oak door did not open. It simply ceased to be a barrier. Standing at the threshold was Merlin. The druid was soaked, water dripping from his matted beard and furs pooling on the flagstones. He brought the storm inside with him. He did not look at the weeping mother. He did not look at the king. His obsidian eyes were fixed solely on the bundle in the midwife's arms. The dead is called other. Merlin's voice was the grinding of stones deep underground. The pact is absolute. Igraine screamed, a sound of heartbreak that was worse than the labor pains. She clutched the air, reaching for her son, but her strength was spent. No, other, you cannot. He is my blood. He is your heir. Other did not look at her. He could not. The shame was a physical weight, crushing his chest. He nodded once to the midwife, a jerky, broken motion. Terrified, the woman stepped forward and placed the crying babe into the druid's waiting arms. Merlin held the future king of Britain not with tenderness, but with the reverence one might show a dangerous weapon. He wrapped his cloak around the child, shielding him from the cold of the castle and the cruelty of the world he was born into. Without a word of farewell, the druid turned and vanished into the mist and the rain, taking the hope of Britain into the wild dark. The years that followed were not kind to the dragon. The loss of the child gnawed at others' mind, and the guilt festered like a wound that would not close. The fire that had once driven him to conquer was replaced by a hollow paranoia. His enemies, sensing the weakness of a king with no heir and a fractured spirit, began to circle. The Saxons pushed from the east, and the petty lords of the north sharpened their knives. It ended not on the battlefield, amidst the glory of steel and shouting men, but in the stifling heat of a banquet hall. Other sat upon his throne, a goblet of wine in his hand, his eyes scanning the crowd of courtiers, men who smiled with their lips but plotted with their eyes. He was thirsty, a thirst that never seemed to leave him. He raised the cup and drank deep. The poison was not subtle. It hit his stomach like molten lead. Other gasped, the goblet clattering to the stone floor, spilling red wine that looked too much like blood. He clutched his throat, his vision blurring, the room spinning into a vortex of color and noise. Foam bubbled at his lips. He tried to stand, to draw his sword, to die on his feet like a warrior, but his legs betrayed him. The High King collapsed, convulsing amongst the rushes and the discarded bones of the feast. As the light faded from his eyes, Uther Pendragon saw the faces of his treacherous lords hovering over him, not to help, but to watch. They were vultures waiting for the carcass to cool. With his last breath, he cursed them, a gurgling sound that no one understood. Then, the dragon was dead. The silence that followed was short-lived. It was broken by the sound of a sword being drawn, then another. Chaos erupted in the hall. Without a king, without an heir, the law was dead. Britain plunged into the abyss. It was a darkness that would last for years. The grand roads the Romans had built were reclaimed by weeds and highwaymen. Villages burned in the night, the orange glow reflecting off the clouds like the eyes of demons. Strong men took what they wanted, and the weak died in the mud. It was an age of wolves, an age of slaughter, where brother turned on brother for a scrap of land or a bag of grain. The unity Other had forged with iron and blood shattered into 1,000 bloody shards. The people prayed for a savior, but the skies were empty and the churches were burning. They did not know that deep in the ancient forests, far from the rot of the courts and the fires of the war, a boy was growing strong. They did not know that the true king was not dead, but waiting for the stone to call his name. Chapter 3. London was not a city of gold. It was a scar upon the banks of the Thames. The great Roman aqueducts had long since crumbled, their arches broken like the ribs of a giant beast picked clean by vultures. In the years since Other's death, The city had become a kennel for the dogs of war. Smoke hung low over the wooden tenements, smelling of roasted meat and unwashed bodies, while the mud of the streets churned under the hooves of 1,000 war horses. They had come from every corner of the fractured isle, kings of the north, lords of the west, and savage warlords who claimed dominion over nothing more than a hill and a hamlet. They gathered not for sport, but for the New Year's tournament, a brutal display of violence intended to establish a hierarchy of strength. But beneath the clash of steel and the roar of the crowds, a silent judge waited in the courtyard of St. Paul's Cathedral. It was a block of marble, weathered by rain and stained by the moss of neglect. Thrust deep into its heart, held fast by an anvil of solid iron, was a sword of exquisite craftsmanship. Letters of gold, now faded, promised the throne to the one who could draw it. For years, men of immense power had strained against the hilt until their veins popped and their muscles tore. The sword had not budged. It had become a monument to their failure, a cruel joke that mocked their ambition. Now, it was largely ignored, a relic of a dead age, guarded only by the bitter cold of winter. Arthur paid the stone no mind. He was 15 summers old, a squire with mud on his face and the weight of another man's armor in his arms. He was not a prince. He was a servant to Sir Kay, the son of Sir Ector, the man who had raised Arthur as a fosterling. The noise of the tournament was a deafening roar in the distance, a cacophony of shattering lances and screaming horses. Panic seized him. In the chaotic preparations at their lodging, amidst the confusion of squires and the drinking of knights, a terrible mistake had been made. Sir Kay's sword, the tool of his trade and the guardian of his life, was missing. Left behind. Stolen. It did not matter. What mattered was that Kay stood in the lists, ready to fight for his honor with an empty scabbard. Boy, Kay had shouted, his face flushed with adrenaline and fear. I cannot fight with my fists. Fetch me a blade, or don't return. Arthur ran. His lungs burned as he sprinted through the frozen streets, dodging carts and beggars. He reached their lodging, but the doors were barred, the owners gone to watch the bloodshed. He hammered on the wood, desperate, tears of frustration stinging his eyes. He could not fail his brother. He could not be the reason Kay was humiliated or killed. He turned, wild-eyed, and saw the churchyard. It was silent, a sanctuary of stone amidst the city of wood, and there, stark against the gray sky, stood the sword in the stone. Arthur did not think of legends. He did not think of prophecies or the high lineage that flowed secretly in his veins. He thought only of Kay. He vaulted the low fence, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened grass. The churchyard was empty. The guards had drifted away to watch the jousts. He approached the anvil. The hilt was cold, the leather grip worn smooth by the hands of 1,000 failed kings. Arthur reached out. He did not plant his feet or brace his shoulder. He simply grasped the handle with the desperate urgency of a boy trying to save his brother. He pulled. There was no grinding of metal on stone. There was no spark, no resistance. The sword slid from the anvil as easily as a pin from a well-oiled lock. It felt light in his hand, balanced perfectly, as if it were an extension of his own arm. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind died. The roar of the tournament faded into a dull hum. Arthur looked at the blade, gleaming with a terrifying, unnatural brightness, and felt a sudden, deep vertigo. He shoved the feeling down. He had a job to do. He ran back to the lists, the naked blade hidden beneath his cloak. He found Kay near the barriers, checking the straps of his shield. I could not get in, Arthur gasped, breathless, presenting the weapon hilt first. But I found this. Kay took the sword, He frowned, the weight unfamiliar. Then he saw the inscription on the blade. He saw the way the steel seemed to catch the light and hold it. His face went pale. He looked at Arthur, then at the sword, then back to the boy he had treated as a servant for as long as he could remember. "Wait here," Kay whispered, his voice trembling. He took the sword to Sir Ector. The older knight recognized it instantly. The blood drained from his face. He grabbed his son and his foster son and dragged them back to the churchyard. "Put it back," Ector commanded, his voice thick with fear. Arthur, confused and frightened by their reaction, stepped up to the stone. He slid the blade back into the anvil. It locked with a solid, final clack. "Now, pull it out," Ector said to Kay. Kay gripped the hilt. He heaved. He strained until his face turned purple. The sword was part of the earth. It did not move. "Now you, Arthur," Ector said softly. Arthur reached out. Again, the steel yielded. It came free with a whisper. Ector fell to his knees in the mud. Kay followed, bowing his head. Arthur backed away, the sword in his hand, terror rising in his throat. "Father, Kay, why do you kneel? It is just a sword." Words spread like a plague. The tournament halted. The stands emptied. The kings and warlords of Britain flooded into the churchyard, their armor clanking, their faces hard and unforgiving. Lot of Orkney, Urien of Gore, Nenters of Garlot, men who had butchered thousands to claim a scrap of power. They saw the boy, they saw the sword. There was no cheering. There were no cries of "Long live the king." There was only a heavy, suffocating silence. Hands drifted to the hilts of their own weapons. Eyes narrowed in calculation and hate. They did not see a savior. They saw a threat. They saw a peasant boy holding the key to the kingdom they believed was rightfully theirs. In the cold wind of the churchyard, surrounded by wolves in human skin, Uther Pendragon stood alone. The sword hummed in his hand, a song of destiny that sounded dangerously like a funeral dirge. The war for the crown had not ended, it had just begun. Chapter 4. The coronation feast was never served. There was no wine poured into golden goblets, no roasting boars turning on the spit, and no bards strumming harps to sing the glory of the new king. Instead, there was only the sound of steel sliding against leather, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of war horses churning the earth. The sword in the stone had chosen a king, but the men of Britain had chosen war. Inside the drafty hall of the tower, the air was thick with tension. Arthur stood at the head of a rough wooden table, the great sword Caliburn resting heavily against his hip. He looked absurdly young. His armor, scavenged from the royal armory, was a size too large, the pauldrons slipping slightly over his shoulders. His face was smooth, devoid of the scars and gray beards that defined the men staring him down. Opposite him stood the 11 kings of the north and west. They were hard men, warlords who had carved their minor kingdoms out of the ruins of Rome with axe and fire. King Lot of Orkney, a bear of a man with eyes like flint, stepped forward. He spat on the floor, a glob of phlegm landing inches from Arthur's boot. "I will not kneel to a bastard," Lot growled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I will not bow to a boy who smells of horse manure and straw. You are no Pendragon. You are a wizard's puppet." Arthur's hand twitched toward his sword, a reflex born of fear rather than aggression. "The stone has spoken," Arthur said, his voice cracking slightly before he found his steel. "I am the son of Uther. You are a mistake," Lot sneered. He turned his back on the boy, signaling his allies. "We will water the fields with your blood, boy, and when you are dead, we will melt that sword down to shoe our horses." They left the hall, the heavy doors slamming behind them with the finality of a tomb sealing shut. The war began not with grand maneuvers, but with a chaotic, desperate scramble. The rebels had the numbers. They had the veterans, the hardened killers who had spent decades slaughtering Saxons and each other. Arthur had only the remnants of the royal guard, a handful of loyal knights including Sir Kay and Sir Ector, and the common folk who believed in the miracle of the sword. And he had Merlin. The armies met on the banks of the River Trent. The sky was a slate gray, weeping a freezing rain that turned the battlefield into a quagmire of sucking mud. It was not a place for chivalry. It was a slaughterhouse. Arthur rode at the front, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He saw the enemy line, a wall of shields and spears stretching into the mist. They chanted his death, a low, guttural roar that vibrated in his teeth. "Do not look at their faces," Merlin's voice drifted from the shadows of his hood. The druid sat atop a black mare, unarmed, yet the air around him crackled with static energy. "Look only at the path forward. To stop is to die." Then the charge. The two lines slammed together with a sound like the earth cracking open. The breath was knocked from Arthur's lungs as his horse collided with a wall of men. He was thrown into the chaos, the world shrinking to the reach of his sword. It was not like the training yards. There was no rhythm here, no rules. A man lunged at him with a rusted axe, screaming. Arthur swung Caliburn blindly. The blade, sharper than any mortal steel, sheared through the man's haft and bit deep into his shoulder. The man fell, screaming, blood spraying hot and bright across Arthur's face. Arthur retched, but there was no time for horror. Another came, and another. He fought with the desperate, flailing energy of survival. He slipped in the mud, scrambling over the bodies of the fallen, his beautiful golden sword coated in gore and filth. He learned quickly that a king does not just give orders, a king bleeds. The battle raged for hours. The river ran red, choked with the bodies of men who had been countrymen the day before. The turning point came not from a tactical genius, but from the raw, terrifying power of the druid. Merlin raised his hands, and the mist thickened, turning unnatural, suffocating. Shapes moved in the fog, phantoms of fire and shadow that spooked the rebel horses and sent panic rippling through their lines. King Lot's formation broke. The discipline of the veterans shattered under the assault of the supernatural and the relentless, desperate fury of the boy king's charge. They retreated, leaving thousands dead in the muck. Arthur stood panting on a mound of corpses, his chest heaving. The rain washed the blood from his armor, mingling it with the mud. He looked out over the field of victory. It did not feel like a triumph. It felt heavy. He saw a young soldier, no older than himself, clutching his intestines and crying for his mother in a dialect Arthur barely understood. Sir Kay rode up, his shield splintered, his face gray with exhaustion. "They run, Arthur. The north is broken for now." Arthur did not smile. He looked at the sword in his hand, the instrument that had made him king. He realized then that the stone had been the easy part. Pulling the sword was a moment. Keeping it was a lifetime of this. A lifetime of cold mud, screaming men, and the terrible silence that followed. He sheathed the blade. The metal scraped against the scabbard, a harsh, grating sound. "Burn the dead," Arthur commanded, his voice older than it had been at sunrise. "And prepare the men. Lot will return. They will all return." He turned his horse away from the carnage, the weight of the crown pressing down on his brow, invisible and crushing. The boy was gone, left somewhere back in the bloody slush of the Trent. Only the king remained, and the king was tired. Chapter 5. The fires of Camlann roared, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls of the great hall. It was a warmth that felt foreign after weeks of freezing rain, and the biting winds of the north. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted boar, spiced wine, and the sweat of men who had cheated death. The victory over the rebel kings was fresh, a heady intoxicant that was stronger than the mead flowing freely into every cup. Arthur sat at the high table, the golden circlet of kingship resting uneasily on his brow. He was flushed, his eyes bright with the adrenaline of survival and the sudden, overwhelming adulation of his court. He was no longer the squire who scrubbed armor. Tonight, he was the dragon's son, the victor, the king. But beneath the laughter and the songs of the bards, there was a hollow ache in his chest. He was surrounded by people, yet he had never felt more isolated. He was a boy playing a god, and the mask was heavy. Into this sphere of heat and noise walked a silence. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and a woman entered. The hall quieted, the boisterous shouting dying down to a murmur of appreciation and curiosity. She was striking, a creature of stark contrasts, hair the color of raven feathers, skin like polished alabaster, and eyes that held the sharp, dangerous intelligence of a hawk. She moved with a feline grace, the silks of her gown whispering against the rushes on the floor. This was Morgause, the Queen of Orkney, wife to King Lot, whom Arthur had just broken on the field of battle. She had come under the banner of truce, ostensibly to negotiate the terms of her husband's surrender. But as she approached the dais, her eyes did not hold the humility of a defeated queen. They held a hunger. Arthur watched her approach, mesmerized. He did not know the blood that flowed in her veins. He did not know that she was the daughter of Igraine and Gorlois, the child left behind when others stole his mother. He did not know she was his sister. He saw only a woman who looked at him not as a symbol, but as a man. "My lord king," she purred, sinking into a curtsy that was more mockery than respect. The north bleeds, but it also remembers how to honor strength. She sat beside him, and the rest of the room seemed to dissolve into a blur of color. She poured his wine, her fingers brushing against his, her touch electric and cold. She spoke to him of things other than war, of the old legends, of the stars, of the burdens of ruling. She wove a web of words, spinning a cocoon around him where he felt understood, seen, and desired. Arthur, starved for connection and drunk on triumph, fell into the gravity of her orbit. When the feast waned and the torches burned low, she led him away from the noise, down the winding corridors to her chambers. The guards turned a blind eye. The king had earned his pleasure. In the dim light of her room, the air smelled of lavender and something darker, musk and ancient secrets. The act that followed was not born of love. It was a collision of needs. For Arthur, it was a desperate grasp for comfort, a way to forget the screams of dying men. For Morgause, it was a ritual of power, a way to reclaim what other had stolen from her family. As they lay together in the tangled sheets, the storm outside began to rise again, thunder rattling the window panes. Arthur slept the sleep of the exhausted, his arm thrown over the woman who shared his blood. But Morgause lay awake, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. She felt the change within her. The seed had taken root. Morning brought a gray, unforgiving light. It also brought Merlin. The druid stood in the doorway of the king's solar, his face a mask of absolute horror. He had been away, communing with the wild spirits of the woods, and had returned too late. He looked at Arthur, who sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, looking younger and more fragile than ever. "What have you done?" Merlin whispered, his voice trembling with a rage that shook the dust from the rafters. Arthur looked up, confused. "I have secured a peace with the north, Merlin. Queen Morgause is your sister." Merlin's scream was a physical blow. The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur went pale, the blood draining from his face as the nausea of realization hit him. He scrambled back, revulsion twisting his gut. No, that is a lie. She is Lot's wife. She is Igraine's daughter, Merlin hissed, stepping forward, his eyes burning with a terrifying fire. And you have sown a harvest of death. The druid turned his gaze inward, his eyes rolling back as the vision overtook him. He did not see the stone walls of Camlann. He saw a field of black mud, slick with the blood of thousands. He saw a kingdom of gold turning to ash. He saw a figure in black armor, a boy with Arthur's eyes and Morgause's cruelty, standing over the broken body of the king. You have birthed your own doom, Arthur, Merlin rasped, the prophecy spilling from his lips like poison. A child has been conceived this night, a child of incest and shadow. He will not be a prince, he will be a plague. On the 1st of May, he will be born, and with his first breath, the clock begins to tick toward the end of everything you will build. Arthur sat frozen, the weight of his sin crushing him. He had won the war for the crown, but in the darkness of his own bedchamber, he had lost the war for the future. The golden age would rise, but the rot was already in the foundation. Mordred was coming. Chapter 6. The forest of the weeping willows was not a place for a king, yet there Arthur lay, sprawled in the churned mud, his chest heaving with the desperate gasps of a man who had just looked death in the face. Beside him, glittering in the gloom like a broken promise, lay the shards of his sword. The blade that he had pulled from the stone, the iron proof of his birthright, was snapped in two. He had ridden out that morning not as a guardian of the realm, but as a bully drunk on the power of his new crown. He had challenged King Pellinore, the Knight of the Fountain, demanding right of way where none was owed. It was a duel fought for pride, not justice. And the steel, sensing the impurity of the hand that wielded it, had failed him. Pellinore stood over the boy king, his own massive broadsword raised for the killing stroke. The knight's breath steamed in the cold air. You fight with the fury of a child, Pellinore grunted, and you will die like one. But the blow never fell. From the shadows of the trees, a word was spoken, a sharp, guttural sound that cracked the air like a whip. Pellinore's eyes rolled back into his skull. The giant man crumpled, his armor clattering as he fell into an unnatural, magical slumber. Merlin stepped from the undergrowth. He did not offer Arthur a hand. He looked down at the shattered sword, and then at the king, his expression one of profound disappointment. The stone gave you a tool to unite men, Merlin said, his voice quiet and dangerous. You used it to feed your vanity. It is broken, and rightfully so. Arthur wiped the blood from his mouth, shame burning hotter than his wounds. I am unarmed, he whispered. A king without a sword is no king at all. Then we must find you a weapon that understands the weight of a soul, Merlin replied. Come. The world is older than iron, Arthur. There are powers here that do not care for your lineage, only your destiny. They rode for hours, leaving the known paths of the forest behind. The trees grew twisted and black, their roots coiling like sleeping serpents. The sounds of the woodland, the chirping of birds, the rustle of deer, faded into a suffocating silence. The air grew damp and cold, smelling of deep, stagnant water and ozone. They crested a ridge and saw it. The lake. It was a vast expanse of water, black as obsidian and still as a mirror. Mist clung to the surface, swirling in patterns that seemed almost sentient. There was no shore, only a sharp drop from the gray rocks into the abyss. It felt like a wound in the earth, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was dangerously thin. This is Avalon, Merlin murmured, the gateway. Arthur dismounted. He felt a vibration in his teeth, a low hum that emanated from the water itself. "What is this place?" "Look," the druid pointed. In the center of the lake, the black water was disturbed. It did not ripple outward, it parted. Rising from the depths came an arm, clothed in white samite that shimmered with a ghostly luminescence. The hand was pale, the fingers long and elegant, and in its grip it held a sword of terrifying beauty. The hilt was woven gold, set with gems that looked like frozen dragon's fire. The blade was not mere steel. It glowed with a pale blue light, etched with runes that hurt the eyes to read. This was not a weapon forged by hammers and fire. It was sung into existence by magic and moonlight. "Excalibur." "There is a boat," Merlin said, gesturing to a small wooden skiff tied to a rotting post. "You must go alone." Arthur stepped into the boat. He did not need to row. The craft moved of its own accord, gliding silently across the glass-like surface. As he approached the center, the air grew frigid. The spectral hand remained perfectly still, rising from the deep like a monolith. Arthur reached out. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from an instinctual understanding of what this meant. To take this sword was to accept a burden far greater than the crown. The crown was politics. This sword was magic. It was a tether to the ancient, non-human powers of the island. His fingers closed around the hilt. The leather was warm, pulsing slightly like a heartbeat. The moment he gripped it, the hand beneath released its hold and sank slowly back into the black water, leaving not a single ripple behind. Arthur sat in the boat, the sword heavy in his lap. He drew it from its jeweled scabbard, and the light of the blade pierced the mist, illuminating his face. It was sharper than thought, lighter than a feather, yet it carried the density of a collapsing star. "You have the sword," Merlin's voice carried across the water as the boat drifted back to the rocks. "But look closely at the scabbard, King." Arthur glanced at the sheath. "It is beautiful. It is life," Merlin corrected him. "The sword cuts. It spills blood. It brings victory. But the scabbard, so long as you wear it, no wound will kill you. You will not bleed to death, no matter how deep the cut." The druid's eyes narrowed. A wise man would value the scabbard more. "But I see in your eyes, Arthur. You only see the blade." Arthur sheathed the weapon, the metallic snick echoing loudly in the silence. He felt invincible. He felt the rush of power that had failed him earlier, now returned tenfold. He did not hear the warning in the druid's voice. He did not see the trap of immortality. "I am ready," Arthur said, mounting his horse. "We shall see," Merlin whispered to the wind. As they turned back toward the world of men, the mist over the lake thickened, swallowing the dark water. The lady had given her gift, but gifts from the deep always came with a price. Arthur rode toward Camelot with a god in a scabbard at his hip, unaware that the sword would one day be the only thing left of him. Chapter 7. The hill of Badon rose from the Somerset levels like a tumor on the earth, steep and unforgiving. It was not a place of beauty. It was a place where the grass had long since been trampled into a thick, suffocating paste of mud and horse dung. Encircling the summit, ring upon ring, waited the Saxons. They were the sea wolves, the destroyers of Rome, a horde of blonde giants clad in boiled leather and stolen mail, their round shields forming a scale-like skin over the hillside. They drummed their axes against the wood, a rhythmic, thundering heartbeat that promised only one thing: extinction. At the base of the hill, Uther Pendragon sat atop his white stallion, Lamray. The horse danced nervously, smelling the death that rolled down the slope in waves. Arthur did not calm the beast. He felt the same vibration in his own marrow. He looked at the men behind him, the remnants of the north, the levies of the west. the knights who had sworn oaths on the cross and the sword. They were outnumbered 5-1. Their faces were gray, hollowed out by months of marching and weeks of hunger. They looked to him not for victory, but for a reason to die well. Arthur touched the scabbard at his hip. The magic of the lady's gift pulsed against his leg, a warm, rhythmic reassurance that he could not bleed, that he could not die. But his men had no such protection. To lead them up this hill was to lead them into a meat grinder. "They wait for us to starve," Sir Kay said, his voice rough with fatigue, reining in his horse beside the king. "They hold the high ground. It is suicide, Arthur." Arthur pulled Excalibur from the enchanted sheath. The sound was not the rasp of steel, but the singing of a high, clear note that cut through the Saxon drums. The blade glowed with a pale, cold fire, illuminating the mist that clung to the valley floor. "Then we shall not keep them waiting," Arthur said softly. He raised the sword. For Britain, for the light. The charge was not a maneuver of grace. It was a scream of defiance. The British cavalry surged forward, hooves throwing up clods of wet earth, slamming into the base of the hill where the gradient was steepest. The momentum carried them into the first shield wall with the force of a collapsing mine. The world dissolved into a chaos of impact. Wood splintered with the sound of cracking bones. Horses shrieked as spears found their bellies, tumbling riders into the muck where they were trampled by friend and foe alike. Arthur was at the tip of the spear, a golden blur in the gray fog of war. Excalibur was not a weapon of war. It was a verdict. Every swing severed iron, leather, and flesh without resistance. The blade shore through a Saxon axe shaft, continued through the warrior's collarbone, and bit deep into the chest of the man behind him. But for every Saxon that fell, 2 more stepped over the corpse. The hill became a ladder of dead bodies. The Britons had to climb over the slain to reach the living. The fighting was so close, so intimate, that Arthur could smell the rotten teeth and stale ale on the breath of the men trying to kill him. He took blow after blow, axes hampering against his shield, spears glancing off his pauldrons. The scabbard held true. Where armor failed, his skin remained unbroken, but the force of the impacts rattled his teeth and bruised his soul. Time lost its meaning. There was only the swing, the impact, the spray of hot blood, and the step upward. The mud grew slick, treacherous with gore. Men slipped and drowned in the slurry of the battlefield. The noise was a physical weight, a cacophony of metal on metal, the wet thud of iron on meat, and the constant, gurgling cries of the dying. Arthur fought with a mechanical desperation. His arm burned, his lungs heaved, but the sword dragged him upward. He was a butcher working a slaughterhouse line that never ended. He saw Sir Ector fall, pulled from his saddle by a hook and hacked to pieces by a dozen knives. He saw the banner of the Red Dragon waver and fall, only to be scooped up by a bloody squire who screamed a curse at the sky. They reached the second ring, then the third. The Saxons, terrifying in their size and ferocity, began to know fear. They saw the boy king who would not bleed. They saw the sword that glowed like trapped lightning. The shield wall, that immovable object, began to crack. "Push," Arthur roared, his voice raw, spitting blood that was not his own. Push them to the edge. With a final, convulsing effort, the British line surged. The Saxons broke. The discipline of the shield wall shattered into a panic. They turned to run, but there was nowhere to go but down the steep cliffs on the far side of Badon. The rout was absolute. The slaughter was industrial. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors of bruised purple and infection yellow, the noise finally died away. The drumming had stopped. The screaming had faded to the low moans of the wounded waiting for the mercy of the knife. Arthur stood alone at the very summit of Mount Badon. He was covered from head to toe in filth, a crust of mud, brain matter, and black blood. His golden hair was matted, his armor dented and scraped. He leaned heavily on Excalibur, using it like a crutch. He looked out over the valley. The Saxon army was destroyed. The threat that had shadowed his entire life, the wolves that had torn at the throat of Britain for a generation, lay dead in heaps at his feet. He had won. He was the High King. The land was his. But he felt no joy. He felt no surge of triumph. He looked at his hands, encased in gauntlets that were slick with red. He looked at the cost of the crown. Thousands of his own people lay broken on the slopes, their lives spent to buy this patch of bloody grass. Merlin appeared at the edge of the clearing, walking among the dead like a gardener, inspecting a harvest. The druid did not smile. He nodded once, a gesture of grim acknowledgement. "It is done," Merlin said, his voice carrying over the wind. "The foundation is laid." Arthur spat a clot of blood onto the ground. He sheathed Excalibur, the light of the blade disappearing, leaving the world dark and cold. "This is not glory," Arthur whispered to the silence. "This is just survival." He turned his back on the setting sun. The war of unification was over. The Saxons were broken. But as the adrenaline faded, Arthur felt the first chill of the long shadow cast by the pile of corpses he stood upon. The Golden Age would be built on bones. And the king wondered, for the first time, if the weight would be too much to bear. Chapter 8. The Cathedral of Camelot was a cavern of gray stone, vast and imposing, designed to make men feel small beneath the gaze of God. On this day, however, it was not the divine that filled the nave, but the suffocating weight of politics. The air was thick with the scent of burning frankincense, heavy enough to choke the lungs, masking the underlying odors of unwashed bodies and damp wool. Arthur stood at the altar, the High King of a unified Britain. He was no longer the boy in the mud of the Trent, nor the butcher on the slopes of Badon. He was scrubbed clean, his golden hair combed, his body draped in robes of crimson velvet that cost more than a village would earn in a lifetime. But beneath the finery, his skin still felt the phantom itch of chainmail. He stood rigid, his hand resting on the pommel of a ceremonial sword, not Excalibur. Excalibur was for killing. This was a day for binding. The doors at the far end of the nave groaned open, admitting a slice of the pale winter light. A hush fell over the assembled lords, men who had spent the last decade trying to slit each other's throats, now forced to stand shoulder to shoulder in uncomfortable silence. Then she entered. Guinevere, daughter of King Leodegrance, was a vision crafted to stop the heart. She wore silk the color of ivory, embroidered with silver threads that caught the flickering candlelight. Her hair was a cascade of autumn fire, bound in a net of pearls. She was beautiful, undeniably so, but as she walked the long aisle, Arthur did not see a lover. He saw a treaty. He saw the loyalty of Leodegrance's vast armies and the security of the western borders. He saw the final stone being placed in the wall he had built to keep the darkness out. She moved with the grace of a deer stepping into a clearing, her eyes fixed on the floor. When she finally reached the altar and looked up, Arthur saw the terror swimming in her gaze. She was a prize to be traded, a peace offering in a world of wolves. He took her hand. Her skin was ice cold. "I take you," Arthur recited, the words feeling like stones in his mouth, "to be my queen, to bind your house to mine." "I take you," Guinevere whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a gale, "to be my king." The archbishop bound their hands with a cord of gold. It was done. The alliance was sealed. The gathered kings and warlords erupted into polite applause, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was a sound devoid of joy. Arthur looked to the shadows of the ambulatory, searching for the one face that mattered. He looked for the wild mane of hair, the eyes of black obsidian, the nod of approval from the architect of this new age. But the shadows were empty. Merlin was gone. The druid had not been seen since the fires of Badon died down. Rumors whispered through the castle corridors like a draft. Some said the wizard had retreated to the wild forests of Brocéliande, screaming at the stars. Others said he had seen something in the flames of the victory feast, a vision so terrible it had cracked his mind. His absence left a void in the court, a silence that was louder than the cheering crowd. Without the wizard, Arthur felt exposed, a mortal man trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. The wedding feast that followed was a spectacle of excess. Whole oxen roasted on spits, wine flowed from silver fountains, and musicians played frantic, joyous reels to drown out the tension. King Leodegrance, drunk and weeping with pride, presented his dowry. A massive, round table of oak, ancient and scarred, large enough to seat 100 knights. For equality, Leodegrance bellowed, spilling wine down his beard, so that no man sits above another. Arthur smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He watched his new subjects. He saw the way the northern lords eyed the western knights, their hands drifting to daggers that were supposedly sheathed in peace. He saw the envy in the eyes of the younger sons, who had no wars left to fight to earn their names. The Saxons were dead. The external threat was gone, and now the wolves were locked in the pen together. Later that night, in the royal chambers, the silence was deafening. Guinevere sat by the window, looking out at the moonlit courtyard. She had not spoken a word since the feast. Arthur stood by the fire, watching the embers die. "It is a heavy thing," Arthur said softly, breaking the stillness, "to wear a crown." Guinevere turned. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of porcelain perfection. "It is a heavy thing to be sold, my lord." Arthur flinched. The truth of it hung between them, sharp and undeniable. He walked to her, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but stopped inches away. He wanted to offer comfort, to promise her a world of light and glory, the golden age he had fought to build. But the words died in his throat. Outside, the wind howled around the towers of the castle, sounding like the mourning cry of a lost spirit. Far away in the deep woods, a madman laughed at the moon, knowing that the seeds of ruin were already sprouting in the cracks of the cathedral floor. The foundation was laid, solid and strong, but it was built over a hollow earth. The peace of Arthur had begun, but it was a peace made of glass, waiting for the first stone to be thrown. Chapter 9. Camelot did not descend from the heavens on a beam of golden light. It was torn from the earth, block by agonizing block, raised by the sweat of 10,000 men and the breaking of 1,000 backs. It stood upon the high ridge not as a palace of dreams, but as a fortress of absolute, terrified order. The white stone of its walls was cold to the touch, quarried from the deep veins of the mountains, and the mortar that held it together smelled of wet lime and crushed bone. It was a scar of civilization etched onto the wild, green skin of Britain. Arthur stood in the center of the great hall, a cavernous space where the rafters were lost in the gloom above. The air here was different. Outside, the wind howled with the chaotic freedom of the moors. Inside, the air was still, filtered, controlled. It was the air of a tomb, or perhaps a cathedral. He listened to the silence. It was what he had fought for, what he had bled for on the slopes of Badon. Yet now that he had it, the silence felt heavy, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. The doors groaned open, breaking the spell. They poured in, the men who had won the war. These were not the courtly figures of later ballads, groomed and perfumed. These were the butchers of the age. Gawain, with his knuckles scarred from breaking jaws. Kay, whose eyes still held the 1,000-yard stare of the shield wall. Bors, Bediver, and the rough kings of the north, who had bent the knee only to save their own necks. They brought the smell of the stables and the tavern with them, a musk of leather, rust, and aggressive masculinity. They gathered in the center of the hall, their voices rising in a sharp, jagged clamor. It had started already. The peace was barely a season old, and already they were tearing at each other. A dispute over land in the west, a perceived slight regarding the order of entry into the feast, a dagger half-drawn, the flash of steel in the torchlight. They were wolves, trained to hunt, now trapped in a pen with no prey left to kill but each other. Enough, Arthur said. He did not shout. He did not need to. The authority of the dragon was a physical weight in the room. The men fell silent, turning to look at their high king. Arthur stepped aside, revealing the object that dominated the center of the floor. It was the gift from Leodegrance, fully assembled now, a monstrosity of ancient oak and iron. It was a table, but it was not a table for dining. It was a ring. A perfect, unbroken circle of wood, vast enough to seat 150 souls. There was no head. There was no foot. There was no place of honor for the most powerful warlord, and no place of shame for the humblest knight. It was a geometric impossibility in a world built on hierarchy. You fight for position, Arthur said, his voice echoing off the stone flags. You fight to be nearest to the king, to be seen as the first among equals. That ends today. He walked to the table and placed his hand on the wood. It was cool and smooth, polished by generations of a past age. Here, there is no head of the table. Here, the king sits beside the knight. The eyes of every man look into the eyes of his brother. You are not lords of your own little patches of dirt anymore. You are the ring that binds Britain. Gawain looked at the table, his brow furrowed. A circle has no leader, Arthur. Who commands? The law commands, Arthur replied, meeting his nephew's gaze. We do not serve a man. We serve the idea that right makes might, not the other way around. One by one, they approached. They touched the wood tentatively, as if expecting it to bite. These were men who understood the hierarchy of the sword. The strong took, and the weak wept. To sit in a circle was to admit that their strength did not grant them privilege. It was a terrifying concept. It was the death of the warlord and the birth of the knight. They sat. The wood creaked under the weight of their armor. Arthur took his place, not above them, but among them. As the circle closed, a strange energy seemed to settle over the hall. The tension of the dagger point faded, replaced by a solemn, grinding responsibility. They looked at one another across the expanse of oak, and for the first time, they saw not rivals, but reflections. This is the order of the round table, Arthur intoned, the words feeling like a spell. We will be the wall against the chaos. We will be the shield of the helpless. We will be the light in the dark. It was a beautiful lie. Arthur looked around the ring of faces, hard, scarred, brutal men trying to pretend they were saints. He saw the cracks in the facade. He saw the boredom in Lot's eyes, the hunger in Pelinor's. He had built a cage of laws to hold back the savage nature of man, but a cage is only as strong as its lock. In the flickering torchlight, the round table looked less like furniture and more like a wheel. And wheels, by their very nature, are destined to turn. High would become low. The bottom would rise to the top. And eventually, the wheel would crush those who built it. Arthur placed his hands flat on the table, feeling the vibration of the castle settling into the earth. Camelot was finished. The Golden Age had begun. But as the wind battered the high windows, sounding like the scratching of fingernails against the glass, the king realized that the hardest war was not the one fought with swords. It was the one fought against the rot of time and the darkness that lived in the hearts of the men sitting right beside him. The empty seats whispered of ghosts yet to come. The circle was closed, but it was not empty. It was waiting. Chapter 10. The snow had buried Camelot. It was a white silence that smothered the world, piling high against the newly quarried stone of the curtain walls. Inside the great hall, the Yule logs had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, nervous shadows that danced on the tapestries. The feast was over, the wine was sour in the bellies of the knights, and the air was thick with a restless, stifling boredom. The round table sat in a circle of lethargy. These were men built for war, now trapped in the cage of peace. They polished their nails with daggers, stared into their cups, and waited for something, anything, to break the monotony of the Golden Age. Arthur sat at the table, rubbing his temples. He could feel the tension in the room, a coiled spring waiting to snap. He had given them laws, he had given them a code, but he could not give them a purpose when there were no enemies left to kill. Then, the storm found a way in. The great oak doors of the hall did not just open, they exploded inward. The iron hinges shrieked in protest as a gust of freezing wind and dead leaves swept through the chamber, extinguishing half the torches in an instant. Out of the swirling snow rode a nightmare. He was a giant, a towering mountain of muscle and menace, mounted on a destrier as massive as a siege engine. But it was not his size that froze the blood in Arthur's veins. It was his color. The intruder was green. Not the green of painted armor, but the vibrant, living green of moss, of deep algae, of ancient forests that have never known the tread of man. His skin was the color of envy, his hair a cascade of tangled vines. In one hand, he held a holly bob, a symbol of peace. In the other, a Danish axe with a blade 4 feet wide, honed to a razor's edge that gleamed with a sickening hunger. The Green Knight rode to the center of the hall, his horse's hooves striking sparks from the stone floor. He did not bow. He did not speak. He simply sat there, a force of raw, chaotic nature intruding on the sterile order of the court. Who acts as the head of this mob? The giant finally rumbled. His voice was the sound of a tree splitting in winter. I have heard tales of the table, tales of bravery. I see only frightened children. Arthur stood, his hand drifting to Excalibur. You are welcome to dismount and eat, stranger, but keep a civil tongue. The Green Knight laughed, a booming sound that shook dust from the rafters. I do not crave your roast meat, little king. I crave a game, a Christmas game. He hefted the axe, the metal singing a low, deadly note. I will allow any man here to strike me one blow with this axe, one blow with all his might. I will not flinch. I will not block. But in exchange, he must swear to find me in 1 year and 1 day, and accept a return blow from me. Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. The knights of the Round Table, the greatest killers in Christendom, looked at the axe, then at the neck of the giant, and they did the math. To strike was easy. To wait a year for execution was madness. The giant sneered. Is this the house of Arthur? Has the fire gone out so quickly? Shame burned Arthur's face. He stepped forward, angry and humiliated. Give me the axe. No. The voice was quiet, trembling. Gawain stood up. He was Arthur's nephew, the youngest of the circle, a man who still believed that honor was a shiny thing found in songs. He walked forward, his face pale as the snow outside. I will play your game. I am the weakest here. My life is the least loss. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Gawain was the best of them, the heart of the order. But Arthur let him take the weapon. The king saw the fear in the boy's eyes, a terror so profound it looked like courage. Gawain took the heavy axe. The Green Knight dismounted, kneeling in the rushes, baring his thick, green neck. He waited, calm as a stone. 1 year, Gawain whispered. He heaved the axe high. He did not hesitate. He could not afford to think. He brought the blade down with a scream of exertion. The sound was wet and final. The blade sheared through the flesh, crunched through the vertebrae, and sparked against the floor. The head of the Green Knight flew from his shoulders, rolling like a discarded ball until it came to rest at the feet of the king. Blood, bright and red, sprayed across the round table, staining the polished oak. The body did not fall. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. The headless trunk pushed itself upright. It walked with a terrifying, steady gait toward the dais. The hand reached down, grabbed the hair of the severed head, and lifted it high. The eyelids of the head snapped open. The eyes were not dead, they were burning with intelligence. The lips moved. Gawain, the head spoke, the voice wet and gurgling but perfectly clear. Look to your oath. 1 year and 1 day. Find me at the Green Chapel. Fail, and be branded a coward for eternity. The body vaulted into the saddle, head still clutched in its hand. The horse reared, kicking clods of earth at the high table, and then they were gone, galloping back into the snowy night, leaving the doors swinging in the gale. Gawain dropped the axe. It clattered loudly, breaking the trance. He looked at his hands, stained with the creature's blood. He looked at Arthur. The feast was ruined, the game was over. But the horror had just begun. Gawain stood in the warmth of Camelot, surrounded by his brothers, but he was already a dead man. The year had started to tick away, second by agonizing second. The golden age had met the ancient dark, and the dark was laughing. The young knight touched his own neck, feeling the pulse there, wondering how many beats it had left before the green terror came to collect its due. The first crack in the round table was not made of malice, but of fear. Chapter 11. The training grounds of Camelot were a churned sea of mud and sawdust, smelling of horse sweat and bruised egos. It was here, beneath the gray, weeping skies of early spring, that the knights of the Round Table sharpened the claws of the kingdom. They were the greatest warriors in Britain, men who had broken the Saxon shield walls and hunted giants in the northern wastes. They were strong, proud, and, as Arthur observed from the gallery, beginning to grow slow. Peace was a subtle poison. It softened the calluses and dulled the reflexes. Sir Kay was leaning heavily on his spear, catching his breath. Sir Bors was laughing too loudly at a joke. His guard dropped. They were comfortable. Then the stranger arrived. He did not ride through the main gate with a retinue of squires and banners. He simply appeared at the edge of the lists, a solitary figure mounted on a white stallion that looked as if it had been carved from marble. His armor was unadorned silver, devoid of the gold filigree, and crests that the court knights favored. It was armor designed for one purpose, to deflect steel. He sat in the saddle with a stillness that was unnatural, a predator waiting in the tall grass. Arthur leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Who is that?" "A Frenchman, by the look of the gear," Gawain muttered, stepping up beside the king. "Or a ghost." The stranger rode to the center of the ring. He dismounted in a fluid motion, his boots hitting the mud with a heavy, wet thud. He drew his sword. It was a plain weapon, the steel gray and dull, but the edge caught the light with a razor's promise. "I seek the king," the stranger said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the din of the yard like a whip crack. It was a voice of absolute, terrifying calm. "But first, I seek a test. Is there a man here who can stand? Sir Kay, ever the prickly defender of the court's honor, scoffed. He stepped forward, swinging his heavy practice mace. Go back to the mainland, boy. We do not spar with travelers. Kay lunged. It was a clumsy attack, born of arrogance. The stranger moved. It happened so fast that Arthur's eyes struggled to track it. The stranger did not block. He flowed around the strike like smoke. His silver gauntlet lashed out, catching Kay in the throat, stopping just short of crushing the windpipe. With his other hand, he swept Kay's legs. The seneschal of Camelot hit the mud with a bone-jarring crash. The stranger's sword was at his throat before Kay had even realized he was falling. Silence descended on the yard. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. Next, the stranger said. One by one they tried. Bedivere with his shield work, Bors with his brute strength, even Gawain with his legendary endurance. The stranger dismantled them all. He fought with a surgical, terrifying efficiency. There was no wasted movement, no flourish, no emotion. He was a machine of violence, a weapon in human form that calculated the trajectory of every blow and countered it before it was thrown. He did not fight to win, he fought to end. Arthur descended the stairs, his heart hammering with a mixture of awe and unease. He walked into the mud, the circle of defeated knights parting for him. Enough, Arthur commanded. The stranger froze. He turned to the king and sheathed his sword in a single, smooth motion. He reached up and unclasped his helm. The face revealed was not the face of a monster. It was devastatingly human. High cheekbones, eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea, and a mouth set in a line of grim determination. He was beautiful, in the way a thunderstorm or a drawn dagger is beautiful. He looked at Arthur, and then he knelt, the mud soaking into his pristine surcoat. I am Lancelot du Lac, he said, bowing his head. I come from the court of King Ban. I offer my sword to the High King of Britain. It is yours until the day I die. Arthur smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. He reached down and hauled the man to his feet, clasping his shoulder. Rise, Sir Lancelot. Camelot has need of your strength. But as Arthur welcomed his champion, he did not see where Lancelot's eyes had wandered. High above, on the stone balcony of the Queen's Solar, Guinevere stood wrapped in furs against the chill. She had watched the display. She had watched the violence. And now she looked down into the yard. Lancelot looked up. Their gazes met across the distance, and the air between them seemed to vanish. It was not a look of courtly flirtation. It was a collision. It was the sudden, shocking recognition of two souls who had been starving for a lifetime without knowing it. In Lancelot's eyes, Guinevere saw a wildness that matched her own caged spirit. In Guinevere's face, Lancelot saw the only thing in the world that mattered more than his honor. The moment lasted only a heartbeat, but it was long enough to shatter the foundation of the world. The noise of the yard returned, the cheering of the squires, the congratulations of the king. But for Lancelot and the queen, the silence remained. Arthur clapped Lancelot on the back, oblivious. Come, the king said, leading him toward the hall. You must meet the queen. Lancelot followed, his heart pounding a traitorous rhythm against his ribs. He had come to serve the king, but as he walked toward the castle, he knew with a sickening certainty that he was walking toward his own damnation. The perfect night had arrived, and he brought with him the seed of Camelot's destruction. Chapter 12. The great hall of Camelot was a cathedral of light and noise. Torches dipped in tallow, and pine resin burned along the walls, casting a warm, golden glow over the revelry. It was the height of the summer feast, and the wine flowed as freely as the river Usk. At the high table, King Arthur laughed, his head thrown back. his hand resting affectionately on the shoulder of Sir Lancelot. To the casual observer, this was paradise. A kingdom healed, a brotherhood united, a golden age made manifest in roast meat and silver goblets. But Morgan Le Fay was not a casual observer. She stood in the shadows of the gallery, her hands resting lightly on the cold stone balustrade. She did not wear the rags of a swamp witch, nor did she carry a crooked staff. She was a vision of dark, regal elegance, draped in silks the color of dried blood, her raven hair bound with threads of copper. She was the Queen of Gore, Arthur's half-sister, the daughter of the Duke, whom Uther Pendragon had slaughtered to satisfy his lust. She watched the king with eyes that were ancient and unblinking. She did not see a hero. She saw the living monument to her father's murder. She saw a usurper sitting on a throne built on rape and lies. To the court, she was merely a visiting royal, a woman of learning and medicine who had come to pay respects to her brother. They did not know that her medicine was poison, and her respect was a mask for a hatred that burned hotter than the castle forges. They cheer for him as if he were a god, she whispered to the darkness, her voice smooth as velvet dragging over gravel. But gods bleed. Her gaze drifted away from the dais, scanning the lower tables where the squires and lesser knights sat. It moved past the boisterous Gawain, past the stoic boors, until it landed on a young man sitting alone at the end of a bench. Mordred. He was no longer the infant snatched from the cradle of incest. He had grown into a wire-thin youth of sharp angles and brooding silence. He had his mother's pale skin and his father's hooded eyes, though he knew neither of them. To the world, he was a bastard nephew of the king, a squire of uncertain lineage tolerated for the sake of charity. He picked at his food, his eyes darting toward the high table with a mixture of longing and venom. He wanted to be up there in the light, but he had been relegated to the dark. Morgan smiled. It was a small, terrifying expression that never reached her eyes. She had found the crack in the wall. She descended the stairs, moving through the crowd like smoke. Men stepped aside without knowing why, feeling a sudden chill as she passed. She did not approach the king. She made her way to the shadows where the boy sat. "The wine is sour at this end of the table," she said softly, standing behind him. Mordred jumped, his hand instinctively going to the dagger at his belt. He turned and looked up into the face of the sorceress. For a moment, he was struck by the resemblance, not to himself, but to the reflection he saw in the mirror when he was angry. "My lady," Mordred stammered, scrambling to stand. "I did not see you." "Sit," Morgan commanded gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was cool, calming. She sat beside him on the hard bench, ignoring the dirt and the spilled ale. "You watch them, Mordred. You watch the great heroes, the shining knights. You wonder why you are not among them." Mordred looked down at his hands, calloused from scrubbing mail and mucking stables. "I am a squire. I must earn my place." "Is that what they tell you?" Morgan leaned in close, her scent filling his head, nightshade and ozone. "They lie. You are not like them, little wolf. You are sharper. You see the world as it is, not as a song." "I am nothing," Mordred muttered, the bitterness leaking out. "Arthur barely knows my name. Lancelot looks through me as if I am air." "Arthur is blind," Morgan hissed, the name dripping with disdain. "He surrounds himself with sycophants and mirrors. He does not look at you because he fears what he sees. He sees a strength he cannot control." She reached out and touched his chin, forcing him to look at her. Her eyes bored into his, peeling back the layers of his insecurity. "You have been told you are a bastard," she whispered, the word a caress. "That you are a mistake, but mistakes are discarded. You were hidden. Why do you think that is?" Mordred frowned, his heart beating faster. "I do not know. Because you are dangerous to him, Morgan lied, mixing truth with venom. You carry a power in your blood that threatens his precious order. He keeps you in the shadows because he knows that if you were ever allowed to step into the light, you would outshine them all. She slipped a ring from her finger, a band of twisted black iron set with a stone that looked like a frozen drop of blood. She pressed it into his palm. "They will never love you, Mordred," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "They will only ever use you. But I see you. I know what you are capable of. You are not a servant. You are a king in waiting." Mordred stared at the ring. For the first time in his life, he felt seen. The shame of his station, the anger at his anonymity, began to harden into something useful. It hardened into ambition. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I am your family," Morgan smiled, standing up and smoothing her skirts, "and I am here to help you take what is yours." She walked away, vanishing back into the throng of dancers and drinkers. Mordred sat alone in the gloom, clutching the iron ring until his knuckles turned white. Up at the high table, Arthur raised a toast to eternal peace, unaware that the dagger that would end his life had just been sharpened in his own hall. The sorceress had not brought an army to Camelot. She had brought a mirror, and she had held it up to the boy who would burn the world down just to be noticed. Chapter 13. The island sat in the middle of a winding river, a patch of gray earth choked by weeds and the bones of forgotten men. It was a place where the sun refused to shine, filtered instead through a canopy of iron-gray clouds that promised rain, but delivered only a clinging, freezing mist. Here, silence reigned, broken only by the rasp of labored breathing and the wet crunch of boots on sodden ground. Two knights faced one another. They were titans of their age, men bred for the saddle and the sword, yet now they stood like weary drunkards, swaying in the mud. Their armor, once polished silver, was battered and rent, slick with gore that was indistinguishable in the gloom. One was Sir Balin le Savage, the knight with the two swords. He was a man cursed by ill fortune, a wanderer who carried tragedy in his wake like a contagion. He wore a shield that was not his own, a borrowed crest that hid his identity. The other was the Red Knight, the guardian of the island, a warrior encased in crimson steel, who had slain every challenger for 100 days. He was Sir Balin, the brother of the man he now fought to the death. They did not know. The tragedy of the world was distilled into this single, muddy circle. The borrowed shield hid Balin's crest, the closed helm hid Balin's face. They saw only an enemy. They saw only the obstacle that stood between them and survival. "Yield," the Red Knight rasped, his voice a ruined croak behind the visor. "You fight like a demon. Yield and live." Balin spat blood onto the grass. His hands were numb, fused to the hilts of his twin blades by dried blood and cramping muscle. "I have no home to return to," he wheezed, "and I do not yield." They charged. It was not a display of skill. The time for fencing had passed hours ago. This was a butchery. They collided with the force of falling boulders, shield smashing against shield, steel hammering against steel. The sound was hideous, the screech of metal shearing, the dull thud of iron on bone. Balin abandoned defense. He dropped his shoulder and drove inside the Red Knight's guard, swinging his sword in a savage, horizontal arc. The blade bit deep into the crimson breastplate, shattering the ribs beneath. At the same instant, Balin brought his heavy mace down in a crushing overhead blow. It struck Balin's helm, caving in the metal, sending a shockwave through his skull that blinded him with white light. They fell together. They did not collapse as enemies, but as lovers might, entangled in a final, bloody embrace, dragging each other down into the cold earth. The silence returned, heavier than before. The mist curled around their prone forms. Minutes passed. The pain began to recede, replaced by the cold creep of the end. Balin, his chest heaving with the rattle of a punctured lung, reached up with trembling fingers to undo his helm. He needed to breathe. He needed to see the sky one last time. The metal clambered onto a stone. Balin, blinking through a curtain of blood, turned his head. He saw the face. It was older, lined with scars he did not remember, but he knew the eyes. They were the eyes he had looked into across the dinner table of his childhood. Balin? The name was a whisper, a prayer shattered against the reality of the moment. The Red Knight turned. His eyes widened, filling with a horror that eclipsed the pain of his wounds. He looked at the sword buried in his chest, then at the man who held the hilt. Balin, is it? Is it you? Balin let out a sound that was not human. It was the wail of a soul realizing it has damned itself. He crawled closer, dragging his broken body through the mud, tears carving clean tracks through the grime on his face. I did not know the shield. I borrowed the shield. Brother, I did not know. Balin reached out, his hand slick with his own lifeblood, and gripped Balin's forearm. It is fate, he whispered, blood bubbling at his lips. We came from the same womb. It is right that we go to the same grave. They died holding hands, the slayer and the slain, indistinguishable in the mud. Days later, King Arthur stood over the fresh mound of earth. The grave was simple, marked only by a single stone onto which the names of the brothers had been crudely chiseled. The king was not alone. Merlin stood in the shadows of the trees. But Arthur felt a profound, aching solitude. He looked at the grave, then at his own hands. He had built the round table to stop this. He had codified the laws of chivalry to ensure that knights fought for justice, not for pride. He had believed that if he built a perfect system, he could cage the beast of human nature. They loved one another, Arthur said, his voice hollow. They would have died for one another. And yet, they killed each other. Iron does not care for love, Arthur, Merlin said softly. And destiny does not care for your laws. You build your walls of stone and your codes of honor, but you cannot legislate against the dark. Arthur fell to his knees. The damp earth soaked into his breeches. He wept, not just for Balin and Balin, but for the terrifying realization that had taken root in his heart. If two brothers, bound by blood and love, could destroy each other because of a masked face and a borrowed shield, what hope did his kingdom have? He looked up at the gray sky, wiping the tears from his face. Is this the end of it, Merlin? Or is this a warning? Merlin did not answer immediately. He looked toward the horizon, where the dark clouds were gathering over Camelot. It is a mirror, King. Look closely. Brother against brother, father against son, friend against friend. The seeds are sown in the blood of the kinslayers. Arthur stood up, but he felt older. He touched the hilt of Excalibur, but it offered no comfort. The sword could kill enemies, but it could not kill fate. The golden age was shining bright, but here, on this lonely island, the king saw the first long shadow of the sunset. The rot was not coming from the outside. It was already in the blood. Chapter 14. The banquet in the Queen's private solar was meant to be a gesture of peace. The room was small, intimate, warmed by a fire that crackled in the hearth, smelling of roasted pear and spiced wine. Guinevere sat at the head of the table, her smile tight and practiced. She had invited 24 knights, a mix of Arthur's loyalists and the fracture-prone northern lords, hoping that breaking bread would mend the cracks forming in the court. On the silver platter before her sat a mound of apples. They were perfect, polished to a ruby shine, imported at great cost from the orchards of Gaul. It was known that Sir Gawain, the king's nephew, had a weakness for the fruit, and the queen had placed the finest, largest apple at the top of the pile, a silent offering to the hot-tempered knight. But fate is a cruel architect. As the wine flowed and the conversation turned to the upcoming hunt, it was not Gawain who reached for the fruit. It was Sir Patrise, a knight of Ireland, a man of laughter and little consequence. He plucked the apple from the peak of the mound, took a bite, and the laughter in the room died. It happened in seconds. Patrise dropped the fruit. He clutched his throat, his eyes bulging, capillaries bursting to turn the whites red. He fell from his chair, crashing into the rushes, convulsing violently. Foam, pink with blood, bubbled from his lips. His skin turned a mottled, bruised purple. Then, with a final, wet rattle that silenced the entire solar, he was dead. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Then, the chairs scraped back. Swords were half drawn. Sir Mador de la Porte, Patrise's cousin, stood over the body. He looked at the half-eaten apple, then he looked at the queen. Poison, Mador whispered, the word hissing like a viper. He pointed a trembling finger at Guinevere. You invited us here. You served the food. You have murdered my kin. No, Guinevere gasped, rising, her face draining of color. I swear it, I treason. Mador roared, his grief turning to a blinding rage. I accuse the queen of treason. She has invited us to our deaths. The doors burst open. Arthur entered, drawn by the shouting. He saw the body. He saw the accusing fingers. He saw his wife, isolated and terrified, surrounded by men who looked at her not as their queen, but as a witch. Arthur looked at the scene, his mind racing. He was the husband who wanted to tear Mador apart for threatening his wife. But he was also the king who had built Camelot on the bedrock of law. If he broke the law to save her, the kingdom would fall. I demand justice, Mador spat, throwing his gauntlet onto the floor. I demand trial by combat. Let God decide if she is a murderer. Arthur looked at the knights of the round table. Gawain looked away, knowing the apple was meant for him, paralyzed by the confusion. Bors looked down. The suspicion was a fog they could not see through. No one stepped forward to pick up the gauntlet. I cannot fight for her, Arthur said, his voice a dry husk. I am the judge. Who will be her champion? The silence stretched, agonizing and long. Guinevere looked at the men she had ruled over, seeing only doubt. Then, from the back of the room, a shadow moved. I will. Lancelot du Lac stepped into the light. He did not look at the king. He did not look at the dead body. His eyes were locked on Guinevere. He picked up the gauntlet. The trial was held at dawn in the muddy field beneath the walls. The air was gray and damp. Mador de la Porte was a bull of a man, fueled by righteous fury. He swung a heavy warhammer, intent on crushing Lancelot's skull. But Lancelot did not fight with anger. He fought with a desperate, terrifying precision. He was the perfect knight, but today he was not fighting for honor. He was fighting for her life. Mador swung. Lancelot stepped inside the ark, his shield taking the blow with a sound like a cracking bell. He drove his shoulder into Mador's chest, sending the larger man stumbling back into the mud. Lancelot's sword flashed once, twice, cutting the straps of Mador's helm, then the leather of his cuirass. It was brutal. It was fast. Lancelot disarmed him, sweeping the legs, and brought the point of his sword to Mador's throat. Yield, Lancelot commanded, his chest heaving, his silver armor splashed with the mud of the lists. Confess that the queen is innocent, or die. Mador looked up at the gray sky, then at the steel hovering over his jugular. I yield, he gasped. The queen is innocent. A roar went up from the crowd, a release of tension that shook the walls. Guinevere, standing by the pyre that had been built for her execution, slumped against the wood, weeping. Lancelot sheathed his sword. He walked to her, ignoring the cheers, ignoring the king who was descending from the box. He offered her his hand. Guinevere looked up. Her face was streaked with tears, her composure shattered. She took his hand. As he pulled her to her feet, she stumbled, falling against his chest. For a moment, just a fraction of a second too long, he held her. He held her not as a champion holds a queen, but as a man holds the only thing that keeps him tethered to the earth. Arthur arrived a moment later, wrapping his cloak around his wife, thanking Lancelot with effusive gratitude. "You have saved us all, my friend," the king said, his eyes wet with relief. But as the court moved back toward the castle, the shadow of the gallows still loomed over the field. The poison had killed Sir Patrise, but a different kind of poison had been injected into the heart of Camelot. The court had seen the way Lancelot fought. They had seen the way the queen looked at him when death was cheated. The accusation of murder was gone, but in its place, a darker suspicion began to whisper in the corridors. Innocence had been proven by the sword, but the heart is not governed by steel. Chapter 15. The ceremony of knighthood was usually a thing of joyous noise. The clatter of steel, the roar of approval from the gallery, the slap of palms on armored backs. But today, the great hall of Camelot was silent, save for the hollow thud of boots on stone and the scratching of rain against the high stained glass windows. In the center of the round table, kneeling not in humility, but with the coiled patience of a viper, was Mordred. He had grown since the night Morgan Le Fay had poured poison into his ear. He was no longer a squire of thin limbs and uncertain gaze. He was a man made of wire and shadow. His armor was black, unpolished, swallowing the light of the torches rather than reflecting it. He wore the crest of Orkney, but he bore the face of Pendragon. Arthur stood before him, Excalibur in hand. The king looked tired. The lines around his eyes had deepened into trenches, and his golden beard was flecked with gray. He looked down at the boy, his nephew, his sin, and felt a cold stone settle in his stomach. He raised the sword. "Do you swear?" Arthur asked, his voice echoing in the quiet hall, "to protect the weak, to uphold the law, to serve the realm until your last breath?" Mordred looked up. His eyes were pale, icy blue, mirrors of the king's own. But where Arthur's eyes held weariness, Mordred's held a terrifying, blank ambition. "I swear it," Mordred said softly. "I will serve the destiny of this kingdom." Arthur hesitated. The phrasing was wrong. It was subtle, a twist of the knife that only a king would feel. But he could not refuse. The boy had earned his spurs in the northern patrols. To deny him now would be an act of tyranny, not justice. "Then rise," Arthur said, tapping the blade first on the left shoulder, then the right. "Rise, Sir Mordred, Knight of the Round Table." Mordred stood. He did not smile. He bowed, a sharp, mechanical motion, and took his place at the table. The circle was complete, but the wood seemed to groan under the weight of the new addition. The other knights shifted uneasily. Gawain clapped his brother on the back, but the gesture was forced. Lancelot watched from across the room, his hand resting instinctively on his sword hilt. They all felt it. The temperature in the room had dropped. Far from the stone walls of Camelot, in the ancient, tangled heart of the forest of Brocéliande, another tragedy was playing out. Merlin ran. The old druid, who had once commanded the elements and bent kings to his will, was breathless. Briars tore at his robes, mud sucked at his boots. He could feel the magic of the earth turning against him. The trees whispered not secrets but threats. The wind did not guide him, it hunted him. He was being herded. "You are old, my love," a voice drifted through the trees, sweet and mocking. "And you are slow." Nimue stepped from behind an oak. She was young, beautiful and terrifying. She was the apprentice who had learned too well, the creature of the lake who had decided that the age of wizards was over. Merlin stopped, leaning against a moss-covered rock, his chest heaving. "You do not understand what you do," he rasped. "The boy, Mordred, he is the end. I must stop him." "The story is written," Merlin, Nimue smiled, circling him like a wolf. "You taught me that yourself. The king rises, the king falls. You are just the narrator who stayed too long on the stage." She raised her hand. The air shimmered. The rock Merlin leaned against began to soften, to stretch. It was not stone anymore, it was a mouth. The earth itself rose up to swallow him. "No," Merlin roared, summoning the last of his fire. He threw a bolt of lightning from his staff, but Nimue caught it in her bare hand, crushing the energy into sparks. "Sleep," she whispered. The ground opened. Crystal stalagmites erupted from the soil, forming a cage, then a tomb. Merlin was encased. He could see out, he could see the leaves falling, he could see Nimue's triumphant smile, but he could not speak. He could not move. He was trapped in a moment of eternal stillness. His mind screamed out, reaching across the miles, trying to touch the mind of the king. "Arthur, beware the sun, beware the black shield." In the hall of Camelot, Arthur flinched. He dropped his goblet, wine spilling like blood across the table. He looked around wildly, his hand going to his temple. "My lord?" Lancelot asked, stepping forward. "What is it?" Arthur looked at the empty seat where Merlin usually sat. It felt colder than before. The presence that had guided him since birth, the shadow that had always been there to catch him, was gone. "He is gone," Arthur whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a hammer. "I am alone." Across the table, Mordred watched the king's panic. He took a slow sip of his wine, hiding the small, cruel smile that curled the corner of his lip. The wizard was gone. The board was cleared. The game was finally fair. Chapter 16. The sun sat high over Britain, a burning eye that offered no shade to the guilty. This was the noon of Arthur's reign, the zenith of the Golden Age. From the white towers of Camelot, the king's law radiated outward like the spokes of a great wheel, pressing the chaotic mud of the countryside into the hard, straight lines of order. But order, as the peasants of the marches were learning, had a weight. On the dusty road to Camlann, a gibbet stood stark against the blue sky. From it swung 3 men. Their faces were purple, their tongues swollen, their bodies twisting slowly in the hot breeze. They were not foreign invaders. They were local lords, petty tyrants who had refused to stop tithing their serfs into starvation. They had ignored the king's new edicts. They had believed that distance from the capital meant safety. They were wrong. Beneath the hanging corpses, Sir Bedivere sat on his horse, cleaning his sword with a rag. The steel was bright, but the rag was red. Around him, a dozen knights of the Round Table sat in silence, their armor gleaming with an intimidating perfection. They were not the heroes of songs today, they were the executioners of the state. "It is done," Bedivere said, his voice flat. He looked at the gathering crowd of villagers. They did not cheer. They stared with wide, fearful eyes. They had prayed for relief from the lords, yes, but to see the nobility strung up like common thieves was a shock to the natural order of their world. It was a terrifying liberation. "Burn the castle," Bedivere commanded. "Let it be a beacon. The king's justice reaches everywhere." Smoke began to curl into the sky, black and oily. It was a scene repeated across the realm. In the north, Gawain broke the knees of bandits who preyed on travelers. In the west, Kay confiscated the lands of barons who hoarded grain during the drought. The Round Table was not just a symbol of unity, it was a hammer. Back in Camelot, the maps were spreading across the great oak table. Arthur traced the lines of the roads he had built, the garrisons he had staffed. He looked like a man who had wrestled a bear into a cage and was now exhausted from holding the door shut. "The reports are good, my lord," Lancelot said, standing at the king's shoulder. "The roads are safe. A virgin could walk from Dover to York with a bag of gold and not be molested." "And the price?" Arthur asked, looking up. His eyes were shadowed. "How many hangings, Lancelot? How many fires?" "Civilization is not a request, Arthur," Lancelot replied gently. "It is an imposition. You cannot ask the wolf to stop eating sheep. You must kill the wolf." Arthur walked to the window. He looked out over the city that sprawled beneath the castle. It was clean. It was prosperous. The markets were full. But he could feel the tension in the air, a low hum of resentment. The minor lords, the men whose power he had stripped away to centralize authority, were whispering in the taverns. They called him a tyrant wrapped in silk. They called his knights the white butchers. "I wanted to build a kingdom of peace," Arthur murmured, "but I have built a kingdom of fear." "They obey because they are afraid of you, Lancelot. They are afraid of the table." "Fear is a foundation." A voice came from the doorway. It was Mordred. He leaned against the stone arch, picking at his fingernails with a small dagger. He was always there, lurking on the periphery, watching, listening. "The people do not love you for your mercy, uncle," Mordred smiled, a cold, thin expression. "They love you because you win. If you stop hanging the rebels, they will not praise your kindness. They will sharpen their knives." Arthur stiffened. He hated how much truth the boy spoke. He hated that the peace he cherished was maintained by the sword he loathed. "We are not tyrants," Arthur said, his voice hard. "We are the law." "Of course," Mordred bowed mockingly, "but iron is iron, whether it is forged into a sword or a shackle." The lords of the north are grumbling. They say the king has forgotten the old ways. They say he listens too much to his French champion and his new god. Mordred's eyes flicked to Lancelot, a challenge burning in them. Lancelot returned the gaze, his hand drifting to his hip. The animosity between them was palpable, a crack in the round table that was widening every day. Arthur turned back to the window. The smoke from the burning castles in the distance was invisible from here, but he could smell it. It was the scent of his legacy. He had tamed the land, but in doing so, he had made enemies of the men who used to rule it. The golden age was shining, but the metal was getting hot. "Keep the patrols moving," Arthur ordered, dismissing them. "If we stop, the chaos returns. We must be harder than the world around us." As the knights left, Arthur remained alone in the solar. He touched the stone of the sill. It was warm. Everything was warm, bright, and hard. He missed the mist. He missed the uncertainty of the early days when survival was the only goal. Now he had to govern, and governing was a brutal, thankless war of attrition. He was the High King of all Britain, and he had never felt more like a jailer. Chapter 17. The Forest of Dean was a place of ancient, tangled roots and canopy so thick it swallowed the day. It was here that the royal hunt had ridden out, a glittering procession of hawks, hounds, and nobility clad in green velvet. They sought the white stag, the elusive prize of the woods, but the sky had other plans. What began as a gray drizzle quickly mutated into a violent, thrashing storm. The heavens opened, drowning the forest in sheets of freezing rain. Thunder cracked like the splitting of oak trees, scattering the horses and separating the party into desperate, rain-blinded groups. Sir Lancelot spurred his white stallion through the brush, shouting for the king, for the squires, for anyone. The wind tore the words from his throat. He was alone in the deluge, until he saw a flash of blue silk near the old ruin of a Roman villa. It was Guinevere. Her mare had thrown a shoe and gone lame. She stood beneath the crumbling archway of what was once a bathhouse, shivering violently, her hair plastered to her skull, her finery soaked and ruined. Lancelot dismounted before his horse had even stopped. He ran to her, ducking under the stone shelter. The space was small, barely a few feet of dry ground protected by a sagging roof of slate. The air smelled of wet moss, ozone, and the fierce, electric tension of proximity. "My queen," Lancelot gasped, water dripping from his nose. "Are you hurt?" "I am cold," she whispered, her teeth chattering. She looked small, stripped of her crown and her court. She was just a woman, frightened and freezing in the dark. Lancelot did not think. Instinct took the reins. He unclasped his heavy wool cloak, still warm from his body, and wrapped it around her shoulders. His hands lingered for a fraction of a second too long on her arms. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, dark pools reflecting the lightning that flashed outside. For years, they had danced this dance. A glance across a crowded hall, a brush of fingers while passing a goblet, a defending sword raised in her name. They had built a wall of honor and duty between them, brick by agonizing brick. They loved Arthur. They respected the law. But the storm had washed the world away. Here, in this ruin, there was no king. There was no Camelot. There was only the roar of the rain and the heat of their bodies. "Lancelot," she breathed. It was not a command. It was a plea. He looked at her, and the wall crumbled. The honor he prized above his life turned to ash in his mouth. He saw her pain, her loneliness, mirroring his own. He saw the woman who had been sold to a king she respected, but could not love with the fire that burned in her soul. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was a collision of starving souls. It was desperate, terrified, and overwhelming. She clung to him, her hands tangling in his wet hair, pulling him closer as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. He pressed her against the cold stone of the archway, his armor clanking against the masonry, a harsh sound that was lost in the thunder. They sank to the dry earth floor of the ruin. The act was not one of joy. It was a sorrowful, frantic consummation. It was a rebellion against the roles they had been forced to play. For a few stolen moments, they were not the queen and the champion. They were just two people finding warmth in the winter of their duty. But as the storm began to fade, the reality of what they had done settled over them like a shroud. They lay apart, breathless, the silence of the forest returning. Guinevere pulled the cloak tighter around herself, staring at the rain-slicked leaves. She did not look at him. She could not. "We have killed him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We have not used a sword, but we have killed him just the same." Lancelot sat with his head in his hands. He felt a sickness in his gut, a physical weight of guilt that was heavier than any armor. He loved Arthur. He would die for Arthur. And yet he had just betrayed him in the most intimate, devastating way possible. "I cannot undo it," Lancelot said, his voice hollow. "I cannot regret loving you, Guinevere. But I regret everything else." "We must go back," she said, standing up, her movements stiff and mechanical. She composed her face, putting the mask of the queen back on, though it fit poorly now. "They will be looking for us. We must pretend that we are loyal," Lancelot finished bitterly. He helped her onto his horse. He walked beside her, leading the beast through the mud, his hand resting on the bridle where hers had been moments before. The ride back to the rendezvous point was a funeral procession. When they found the king, Arthur was frantic with worry, soaking wet, shouting their names. When he saw them emerge from the trees, his face lit up with pure, unadulterated relief. "Thank God," Arthur cried, running to them, embracing Lancelot. then helping Guinevere down with tender hands. I thought the storm had taken you. I thought I had lost the two people I love most in the world. Lancelot looked at the king's open, trusting face. He felt the bile rise in his throat. Arthur's joy was a dagger in his heart. The king did not know. He did not see the shadow that now stood between them. Guinevere smiled, a brittle, fragile thing. "We are safe, my lord. Lancelot protected me. He always does," Arthur beamed, clapping his champion on the shoulder. Lancelot forced a nod. He looked at his hands, expecting to see them stained with blood. They were clean. That was the horror of it. The sin left no mark on the skin. It only rotted the soul. The golden age was still shining around them, but the heart of it had just stopped beating. The betrayal had begun, and it would not end until Camelot burned. Chapter 18. The Feast of Pentecost had always been the brightest day in the calendar of Camelot. It was a day of white linen, fresh flowers, and the reaffirmation of oaths. But this year, the air in the great hall was thick, pressing down on the shoulders of the knights like a wet wool cloak. The laughter was brittle. The wine tasted thin. Arthur sat at the round table, looking at the empty chair to his right. It was the Siege Perilous. For 20 years, it had remained vacant. It was a seat of death, cursed by Merlin himself. Only the perfect knight may sit here, the wizard had warned. Any other who tries will be consumed by the earth. Many had looked at it with ambition, but fear had kept them standing. It was a silent judge, a constant reminder of their collective inadequacy. The doors to the hall swung open. There was no herald, no fanfare, just a boy walking out of the bright summer afternoon into the gloom of the castle. He was dressed in armor of white enamel, devoid of scratches or dents. He wore no helmet, revealing a face that was terrifying in its innocence. He looked like Lancelot, the same high cheekbones, the same intense gaze. But where Lancelot's face was etched with the lines of war and secret guilt, this boy's face was a blank page. He was beautiful, but it was a cold, statuesque beauty. He looked like an angel who had come to judge the living. It was Galahad. Lancelot, sitting 3 seats away, went pale. He gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He knew who this was. He knew the shame of his conception, a night of trickery, where he had lain with the Lady Elaine believing she was Guinevere. This boy was the living proof of his own fallibility, a mirror reflecting everything Lancelot wished he was, and everything he had failed to be. The boy walked straight to the king. He did not bow. He simply nodded, a gesture of respect between equals that sent a murmur of shock through the room. "I have come to take my place," Galahad said. His voice was clear, lacking the gravel of the veteran soldiers around him. "The seats are filled, boy," Sir Kay grunted, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "Save for the perilous. And unless you have a death wish, I suggest you find a bench with the squires." Galahad turned his gaze on Kay. It was not an angry look, but it was heavy. Kay shrank back, silenced by the sheer weight of the boy's purity. Galahad walked to the Siege Perilous. The hall held its breath. Even Arthur half rose from his chair, a warning on his lips. "Wait, you do not know." Galahad did not hesitate. He sat. There was no crack of thunder. The floor did not open to swallow him. Instead, a hum filled the room, a vibration that rattled the silver goblets on the table. The letters of gold that had been inscribed on the back of the chair since the beginning of time. "This is the siege of the true knight," suddenly flared with a blinding light, then settled into a steady, warm glow. Galahad looked around the circle. He looked at Gawain, who was nursing a hangover. He looked at Bors, who was cleaning his nails. He looked at Lancelot, who could not meet his eyes. "The circle is complete," Galahad said softly. but it did not feel like a completion. It felt like an indictment. The presence of Galahad changed the air in the room. Beside him, the other knights looked suddenly shabby. Their armor looked dull, their faces lined with the sins of 100 petty cruelties and lusts. Galahad was a diamond dropped into a pile of coal. He shone so brightly that he made everything else look dark. Arthur sank back into his chair. He looked at his knights, his friends, his brothers. He loved them for their flaws, for their humanity. But Galahad was not human. He was an ideal. He was the embodiment of the code they all claimed to follow, but constantly broke. "Welcome, Sir Galahad," Arthur said, his voice sounding tired. "You bring a great light to our hall." "I bring the end of the waiting," Galahad replied, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. "The vessel draws near. The time of earthly conquests is over. The spiritual quest begins." A chill wind seemed to sweep through the hall, extinguishing half the torches. The shadows lengthened. The knights exchanged nervous glances. They were warriors. They understood how to kill giants and break sieges. They did not understand this boy with his talk of spiritual vessels. Lancelot stood up abruptly. "I need air," he choked out, turning and striding from the hall. He could not bear it. He could not sit beside the son who was everything he was supposed to be, the son whose very existence was a testament to his own broken vows. Arthur watched him go. He looked at Guinevere, who was staring at Galahad with a mixture of awe and terror. She knew, they all knew, the game had changed. The golden age of feasts and tournaments was over. The moral rot that had been festering beneath the floorboards had finally been exposed by the blinding light of perfection. Galahad sat still as a statue in the Siege Perilous, his hands folded in prayer. He was the pinnacle of Camelot, the final piece of the puzzle. But as Arthur looked at him, he realized with a sinking heart that perfection is not a thing that can live comfortably among men. Perfection does not build, it judges. And the judgment had just begun. The round table was full, but the fellowship was broken. Chapter 19. The storm had broken over Camelot, but it was not a storm of rain and thunder. It was a silence. The great hall, usually a cavern of noise and feasting, was unnervingly quiet. The knights sat at the round table, their plates untouched, their goblets full. The air was thick, charged with an electricity that made the hair on their arms stand up. It was the heavy, suffocating atmosphere that precedes a miracle or a disaster. Arthur sat at the head of the circle, his hands gripping the arms of his throne. He felt it too, a vibration in the stone floor, a hum in his teeth. He looked at Galahad, who sat perfectly still in the Siege Perilous, his eyes closed, a faint smile playing on his lips. The boy knew. Then the darkness came. The torches along the walls did not flicker, they simply died. The great fire in the hearth was extinguished as if a giant hand had smothered it. The hall was plunged into a pitch-black void. Panic flared. Men reached for sword hilts, the scrape of steel loud in the sudden night. "Be still," a voice whispered. It was not Arthur, it was not Galahad. It seemed to come from the air itself. A light appeared in the center of the table. It was small at first, a single point of blinding white, like a star brought down to earth. It grew, expanding outward, bathing the terrified faces of the knights in a spectral, milky luminescence. It was beautiful, but it was a cold beauty. It did not offer warmth. It offered truth. Floating in the center of the light, veiled in white samite, was a cup. It was the Grail, the vessel of the Last Supper, the cup that had caught the blood of Christ. It drifted through the hall, moving slowly past each knight. As it passed, the air was filled with scents, spices from the east, fresh rain on dry earth, the smell of a mother's embrace. Sir Gawain wept openly, tears streaming down his scarred face. Sir Bors fell to his knees. Even Mordred, the cynic, stared with his mouth agape, momentarily stripped of his malice. For a heartbeat, their hunger was fed. Not their hunger for meat, but the deep, gnawing hollowness in their souls. They saw their own potential. They saw a world without pain. They saw salvation. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vessel vanished. The light was sucked away, and the torches flared back to life. The hall was mundane again. The smell of smoke and stale wine returned, but the men were changed. Gawain stood up. He was shaking, his eyes wide with a fanatic's fire. He drew his sword and held it high. "I vow," he roared, his voice cracking. "I vow this night that I shall not rest. I will leave this hall, and I will not return until I have seen the Grail unveiled. I will ride for a year and a day, or a lifetime if need be. I vow it," shouted Bors. "And I," cried Percival. One by one they stood. The contagion spread like wildfire. Knights who had grown fat on peace, men who were bored with patrolling safe roads and judging petty disputes, saw a new purpose. They saw a quest, not a war for land, but a war for God. They clamored over one another, swearing oaths, shouting to their squires to saddle their horses. Arthur sat frozen. He watched the scene with a growing horror. He saw the ecstasy in their eyes, but he also saw the madness. He saw the disintegration of everything he had built. "Stop," Arthur shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. "Think on what you do." The hall quieted, but the fire in their eyes did not dim. They looked at their king, but for the first time, he seemed small to them. He was an earthly king. They had just seen the divine. "You swear to leave?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling with grief. "You swear to abandon the realm. Who will guard the borders? Who will enforce the law? You chase a ghost, and you leave the living to the wolves." "We chase salvation, my lord," Lancelot said softly. He stood apart from the others, his face pale. He had seen the Grail, but when it passed him, he had felt a burning heat. He knew, deep in his heart, that his sin with Guinevere would bar him from ever touching it. Yet, he had to try. He had to believe he could be redeemed. The table was built for this, to seek the highest good. The table was built to protect Britain. Arthur pleaded, standing up and walking into the center of the ring. This is not protection. This is suicide. You will scatter to the four winds. You will die in swamps and forests, alone, for a dream." "It is a beautiful dream," Galahad said. He stood up, and the other knights parted for him. "The land is sick, uncle. The king is weary. Only the Grail can heal the wound." Arthur looked at his nephew. He looked at Lancelot. He looked at the empty seats that would soon be filled with dust. He realized then that the golden age was over. The round table had not been broken by an enemy army. It had been broken by hope. "Go then," Arthur whispered, turning his back on them so they would not see the tears in his eyes. "Go and find your God. But know this, when you return, if you return, you will find an empty hall. You act for your souls, but you doom your kingdom." The knights rushed out, energized, deaf to the tragedy in the king's voice. They poured into the courtyard, mounting their horses, shouting farewells that sounded like victory cries. Arthur stood alone in the great hall. The feast lay ruined on the table. The torches flickered, casting long, lonely shadows. He touched the wood of the round table, feeling the grain under his fingers. It was just wood now. The circle was broken. The defenders were gone. And in the silence of the empty castle, Arthur heard the faint, scratching sound of something waiting in the dark to take their place. The spiritual rot had begun. Chapter 20. The wind had changed. It no longer carried the scent of summer blossoms or the wood smoke of feasting fires. It blew cold and thin through the high arches of Camelot, whistling a lonely tune that rattled the shutters of the great hall. King Arthur sat on his throne, wrapped in a heavy cloak of ermine that offered no warmth against the chill in his bones. Before him lay the round table, the great oak circle that had once been the beating heart of the world. Now it was a graveyard of memories. Dust had begun to settle on the empty chairs. The names inscribed in gold, Gawain, Percival, Bors, Lancelot, seemed to mock him. 150 seats, and barely a dozen were filled. The court was a ghost town. The bustling energy of squires, the laughter of ladies, the constant, reassuring clank of armored men, it was all gone. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scratching of a clerk's quill in the corner. "My lord," the clerk whispered, fearful of disturbing the tomb-like quiet. "The petition from the northern wool merchants." Arthur waved a hand, a gesture of weary dismissal. "Grant it, just grant it." He looked at the empty seat of Lancelot. The absence of his champion was a physical pain, an amputation. Without the bright lights of his order, Arthur saw the castle for what it truly was. A pile of cold stone perched on a hill, surrounded by a world that was slowly reverting to the wild. The laws he had written felt fragile now, paper walls trying to hold back a hurricane. Far from the sterile silence of the capital, the reality of the quest was a nightmare of mud and madness. The wasteland was not a place on a map. It was a condition of the soul that had bled into the earth. The trees here were black skeletons, their branches clawing at a sky the color of a bruise. The ground was a slurry of gray ash and stagnant water. There was no game to hunt. The streams were poisoned. Sir Ector de Maris, brother of Lancelot, rode his starving horse through a ravine that smelled of sulfur. He had been riding for 6 months. He had seen no Grail. He had seen no angels. He had only seen the worst of men. He rounded a bend and saw 2 knights fighting in a clearing. They were not sparring. They were trying to murder one another. They rolled in the muck, stabbing with daggers, screaming curses that were unintelligible. Ector recognized the shield of one. It was Sir Uwain, a man of honor, a man who had once sworn to protect the weak. Now, Uwain was biting the ear off his opponent, his face a mask of feral desperation. "Stop," Ector shouted, drawing his sword. In the name of the king, the combatants froze. They looked up. Their eyes were yellowed, sunken deep into skulls that were stretched tight with skin. They did not see a brother knight. They saw meat. They saw a horse that could be eaten. "The cup," Uwain rasped, drool mixing with blood on his chin. "He says he saw the path. He lies. The path is mine." "There is no path," the other knight screamed, lunging with a rusted knife. Ector watched in horror as Uwain drove his dagger into his brother's throat. The sound was wet and final. Uwain stood up, panting, staring at Ector with a terrifying emptiness. "I must find it," Uwain whispered, swaying. "If I find it, I will be clean." He turned and stumbled into the dead forest, leaving the corpse to rot in the rain. Ector lowered his sword. He felt a scream building in his chest, but he swallowed it down. This was the quest. It was not a journey of glory. It was a mirror that showed every man his own breaking point. The Grail demanded perfection, and in the face of that impossible standard, men were cracking like cheap glass. They were starving not for food, but for meaning, and in their starvation, they were eating each other. Back in Camelot, the night had fallen. Arthur walked the ramparts alone. He looked out over the darkened countryside. There were no patrol fires burning in the distance. The bandits had returned to the roads. The wolves were howling closer to the walls. "They chase a ghost," Arthur said to the wind, "and they leave me to bury the dead." A shadow detached itself from the wall. It was Mordred. He had not gone on the quest. He had stayed, watching the king, watching the emptiness grow. "Ghosts are powerful things, Uncle," Mordred said softly, his voice smooth as oil. "They make men forget their duty. They make men forget their king." Arthur did not turn. He gripped the cold stone of the battlement. "They will return, Mordred. They will find it, and they will heal the land." "Some will return," Mordred corrected, stepping closer. "But they will not be the men who left, and when they come back, broken and bitter, who will they blame for sending them into the dark?" Arthur closed his eyes. He knew the answer. They would blame him. The Grail was supposed to be the crowning jewel of his reign, the spiritual capstone to the political peace. Instead, it was becoming the hammer that would shatter the foundation. The hall was empty, but the shadows were filling up with resentment. The golden age was gone, lost in the mist of the wasteland, and the king was left holding a crown that felt heavier with every passing hour. Chapter 21. The castle of Corbenic did not look like it belonged to the world of men. It sat on a crag of jagged rock, isolated by a churning sea of mist that smelled of salt and ancient decay. The stones of the fortress were black, slick, with a perpetual dampness, and the gates stood open like the jaws of a dead beast. Lancelot du Lac walked the causeway alone. He had lost his horse weeks ago in the swamps of the wasteland. His silver armor, once the envy of Christendom, was rusted and dented. His cloak was a tattered gray rag that whipped in the bitter wind. He was a man hollowed out by months of searching, by hunger, and by the relentless, gnawing voice of his own conscience. He entered the courtyard. There were no guards. There were no servants. The silence was absolute, heavier than the silence of the grave because it felt expectant. It was waiting for him. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the keep and stepped into the darkness. A single corridor stretched before him, lit by a faint, pulsing light at the far end. The air grew warm, carrying the scent of frankincense and lilies, the same scent that had filled the great hall of Camelot the night the vision appeared. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the end of the road, the redemption he had prayed for. Lancelot walked toward the light. As he moved, the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe. They were not random shapes, they were memories. He saw the face of Arthur, smiling and clasping his hand. He saw the faces of the men he had killed in tournaments and wars. And then he saw her. Guinevere. Her face was not smiling. It was twisted in ecstasy and sorrow, the way she looked in the stolen moments of their sin. "Get out of my head," Lancelot hissed, squeezing his eyes shut. "I am here for God, not for her." He reached the door at the end of the hall. It was open a crack. The light inside was blinding, a pure, white radiance that hurt to look upon. He could hear singing, a choir of voices that sounded like crystal breaking. Lancelot fell to his knees. He crawled the last few feet. He reached out a trembling hand to push the door open. He wanted to see it. He wanted to touch the cup. He wanted to be washed clean. Unworthy. The word was not spoken. It was a physical blow. A blast of wind, hot as a furnace, erupted from the chamber. It picked Lancelot up and threw him backward. He slammed against the stone wall, the breath driven from his lungs. Unworthy, the voice thundered again, shaking the foundations of the castle. "You come to the house of the Lord with the taste of another man's wife on your lips. You bring your filth into the sanctuary." Lancelot gasped, trying to stand. "I repent." He screamed, tears carving tracks through the grime on his face. "I love my king. I serve the table. You serve yourself." The voice roared. The light in the room flared, turning from white to a searing red. "You are the greatest of earthly knights, Lancelot. Your arm is strong. Your courage is absolute. But your heart is a knot of vipers. You love the sin more than the salvation." Lancelot crawled forward again, fighting the wind. "Let me see it, just once. Let me know that I am not damned." "Look then," the voice whispered, sudden and cold. "Look at what you have traded your soul for." The door swung wide. Lancelot looked. He did not see the Grail, he saw a mirror. In the glass, he saw himself. But it was not the knight in shining armor, it was a monster. He saw a man who had lied to his best friend every day for a decade. He saw a man who had taken the trust of a king and twisted it into a shroud. He saw the rot in his own soul, a black cancer that had started the moment he first touched the queen. He saw the future. He saw Camelot burning. He saw Arthur dying on a field of blood, and he saw himself standing over the ruin, holding nothing but ash. "No," Lancelot wailed, covering his eyes. "No." The door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. The light vanished. The warmth was replaced by a biting cold. Lancelot lay in the dark corridor, curled into a ball, sobbing like a child. He had been denied. The greatest knight in the world, the man who had never lost a battle, had been defeated not by a sword, but by the truth. He was not the hero. He was the villain of the story. He lay there for days, drifting in and out of a fever dream. When he finally found the strength to stand, he was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, burned away by the divine rejection. In its place was a terrible, quiet despair. He stumbled out of Corbenic, back into the mist. He had to return to Camelot. He had to go back to the king he had betrayed and the woman he could not stop loving. But he knew now that there would be no forgiveness. The Grail had judged him, and the verdict was final. He was a dead man walking, carrying the weight of a secret that was destined to destroy everything he had ever sworn to protect. The champion had fallen, and the fall was eternal. Chapter 22. The city of Sarras was not built of stone or wood. It was built of memory and wind, a mirage shimmering on the edge of the world where the desert met the sky. The sand here was white as bone, and the sun did not burn. It illuminated. 3 knights stood before the gates. Their armor was battered, their cloaks stained with the mud of 1,000 miles, their faces gaunt with the hollow hunger of the spirit. Percival, the innocent fool who had learned wisdom through suffering. Bors, the pragmatic soldier who had found faith in the trenches of despair. And Galahad. Galahad did not look tired. He did not look hungry. He glowed. The white enamel of his armor was pristine, untouched by the grime of the journey. He stood taller than the others, his eyes fixed on the horizon, seeing something that Percival and Bors could only sense as a vibration in the air. "We are here," Galahad whispered. The end of the line. The gates of Sarras swung open. There were no guards, only a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against the ears. They walked through the streets. The buildings were vague, shifting shapes of light and shadow, populated by figures that might have been angels or ghosts. They moved toward the spiritual palace at the city's heart. Inside, the room was simple. A stone table, a white cloth, and upon it the cup. The Holy Grail did not shine with the blinding light that had terrified the court at Camelot. Here, in its home, it was quiet. It was a simple vessel, humble and terrifyingly real. It sat there, a physical object that contained the infinite. Bors fell to his knees, weeping silently. He felt the weight of his sins, his violence, his doubts being lifted, but the relief was so intense it was almost painful. Percival bowed his head, overwhelmed by a peace that his simple heart had always yearned for. But Galahad walked forward. He approached the table as a groom approaches the altar. He reached out and took the cup in his hands. The moment he touched it, the world seemed to hold its breath. The walls of the palace dissolved. The sky above turned a deep, velvet violet, studded with stars that burned with the fury of creation. Galahad lifted the Grail to his lips. He did not drink wine, he drank truth. He drank the raw, unfiltered essence of God. He lowered the cup. His face was radiant, terrible in its joy. He turned to his companions. "I have seen," Galahad said, his voice echoing not in the room but in their minds. "I have seen the beginning and the end. I have seen the face of the Father. What must we do?" Percival stammered, blinded by the light radiating from his friend. "Do we take it back? Do we heal Arthur?" Galahad smiled, and there was a sadness in it. "The world is not ready to be healed, Percival. The world loves its wounds too much. The cup cannot exist where there is greed and lust and hate. It must leave." "And you?" Bors asked, dread pooling in his stomach. "I cannot stay," Galahad replied. "I have touched the infinite. To return to the finite, to return to mud and blood and politics. It would be a hell I cannot endure." He looked up at the sky. "Lord," he cried out, raising his arms, "I have finished the work. Release me. Let me come home." The response was immediate. A beam of light, solid and heavy, descended from the heavens. It struck Galahad, dissolving his armor, his flesh, his very being into pure energy. There was no pain, only a rush of wind and a sound like a great bell tolling. Galahad ascended. He rose into the violet sky, a comet of white fire, taking the Grail with him. The cup vanished from the table. The light faded. The silence returned, but now it was empty. Percival and Bors were left alone in the shifting city of Sarras. The sand blew around their boots. The miracle was over. The quest was achieved, and they were left with nothing. "He is gone," Percival whispered, the tears freezing on his cheeks. "The best of us? Gone." Bors stood up, his joints creaking. He looked at the empty table, and the Grail is gone. "Arthur sent us to find salvation for the kingdom. We found it, and it left us." They walked back out of the city, leaving the mirage to fade into the desert. They had a long journey ahead. They had to cross the sea, cross the mountains, and return to the rain-soaked hills of Britain. They had to go back to Camelot and tell the king the truth. They had to tell him that the quest was a lie. The Grail was not a cure for the rot of the kingdom. It was an exit door. It had taken the only perfect thing in the world and removed it, leaving the rest of them, the flawed, the broken, the human, to wallow in the dark. The Golden Age had not just ended. It had been judged and found wanting. As Bors and Percival trudged back toward the coast, they felt the chill of the coming winter. They were returning to a hall that was emptier than when they left, to a king who was waiting for a healing that would never come. The spiritual heart of the round table had ascended, and down below, the wolves were beginning to circle. Chapter 23. The gates of Camelot groaned open, the iron hinges screaming against the rust that had gathered during the long, wet autumn. There were no trumpets to herald the return. There were no flower petals scattered on the cobblestones, no cheering crowds leaning from the timbered houses. There was only the sound of rain hissing on the stones and the slow, rhythmic clatter of hooves that sounded dangerously like a funeral march. They rode in single file, a ghost procession emerging from the mist. 2 years ago, 150 knights had ridden out, their armor gleaming, their hearts set on the divine. Today, less than 30 returned. Arthur stood in the courtyard, the rain soaking his velvet mantle, turning the crimson fabric almost black. He watched them come. He looked for the white armor of Galahad. He looked for the innocent face of Percival. He looked for the strength of Lancelot. He saw only wreckage. The men who slid from their saddles were not the heroes of the Golden Age. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed survivors. Their armor was mismatched, scavenged from the dead. Their cloaks were wrought gray rags. They did not look at their king with love. They looked at him with the vacant, thousand-yard stare of men who have seen the edge of the world and found nothing but precipice. Sir Bors was the first to approach. He limped heavily, favoring a leg that had healed wrong in some distant swamp. He knelt in the mud, but he did not bow his head. He looked Arthur in the eye, and the king saw a terrifying finality there. "It is done, my lord," Bors rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "The quest is achieved." "And the cup?" Arthur asked, a desperate hope fluttering in his chest like a trapped bird. "Where is the vessel that will heal the land?" "Gone," Bors said flatly. "Galahad touched it, he ascended. The cup went with him. It was too pure for this earth, Arthur. It was not meant for us. It was a test, and we were left behind." The words hung in the damp air, heavier than the stone walls. The healing was a lie. The salvation had visited, judged them unworthy, and departed. Arthur looked at the other knights. He saw Gawain, who had returned weeks earlier, bitter and angry, having killed more men on the quest than he had saved. He saw Lionel, whose mind was cracked, muttering to himself about demons in the trees. The quest had not purified the Round Table. It had purged it. It had stripped away the best men, Galahad, Percival, and left the broken, the violent, and the disillusioned. That night the great hall was warm, but it felt like a tomb. The feast was subdued. The empty seats were no longer just vacant. They were accusations. The camaraderie that had once bound these men together was gone, replaced by a sullen, resentful silence. They ate like animals, tearing at the meat with a savagery born of long hunger. In the shadows of the lower tables, far from the dais where Arthur sat in silent mourning, a new court was forming. Mordred sat with his back to the wall, a tankard of ale in his hand. He was pristine, untouched by the horrors of the wasteland, because he had never left. He watched the returning knights with the predatory focus of a wolf assessing a wounded herd. He saw their trauma. He saw their anger. And he saw his opportunity. He leaned in toward Sir Agravain, Gawain's brother, a man who had returned with a festering wound in his side and a deeper wound in his pride. "Look at him," Mordred whispered, nodding toward the king. "He sits there, clean and fed, while you ate rats in the marshes." Agravain grunted, his eyes narrowing. "He is the king, Mordred. It was a holy cause, was it?" Mordred swirled his ale. "Or was it a way to get rid of you? To send the violent men away so he could sit in peace? What did you find out there, Agravain? Did you find God? Or did you find that the king's dream is a nightmare for men like us?" Agravain didn't answer, but his grip on his knife tightened. "He demands perfection," Mordred continued, his voice a low, soothing poison. "He talks of laws and codes and high ideals. But look at Bors. Look at yourself. You aren't angels, Agravain. You're killers. That's what he made you. And now he looks at you with disappointment because you didn't come back as saints." Mordred stood up and moved down the bench, clapping a hand on the shoulder of another survivor, Sir Mador. "You bled for a ghost, my friend. And now that the ghost is gone, what is left for you here? Do you think he values you? Or does he only mourn the ones who left?" The seeds were planted in the fertile soil of their trauma. The knights looked at Arthur, their weary, distant king, and they didn't see a father anymore. They saw a man who had spent their lives on a gamble that failed. Arthur felt the shift. He sat on his throne, looking out over the fractured hall. The Round Table was physically intact, but the circle was broken. The spiritual rot had set in. The quest for the Grail had been meant to save them, but instead it had hollowed them out. The Golden Age had died in the desert, and what had returned to Camelot was something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. As the torches burned low, The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and connect, linking Mordred to Agravain, to Mador, to the growing faction of the discontented. The enemy was no longer at the gates. The enemy was sitting at the dinner table, and he was hungry. Chapter 24. The abduction was not a grand military maneuver. It was a snatch and grab, ugly and fast, executed in the green solitude of the maying fields. Meleagant, a renegade lord whose ambition had festered in the shadows of Arthur's failing peace, had taken the queen. He had dragged Guinevere from her horse, his men butchering her unarmed escort in the tall grass, and ridden for his fortress in the land of Gore. Lancelot did not wait for the king's army. He did not wait for a council of war. He rode out alone, a silver bolt of lightning fueled by a panic that bordered on madness. He rode his white stallion into the ground, spurring the beast until its heart burst on the rocky road to the border. When the horse fell, dying in the mud with a shuddering groan, Lancelot did not mourn. He did not stop. He ran. He ran in his heavy armor, his breath tearing at his lungs, his boots slipping on the slate. But the road to Gore was long, and a man in plate cannot outrun the night. He came upon a dwarf driving a cart. It was a rough, wooden thing, stained with old blood and the filth of the road. It was a convict's cart, the transport of thieves, murderers, and those awaiting the gallows. To ride in it was to forfeit one's honor. It was a social death sentence. A knight of the Round Table would sooner walk on broken glass than be seen in such a vehicle. "I seek the queen," Lancelot gasped, his chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes. "Have you seen her?" The dwarf looked down, his face a mask of cruel amusement. "I have seen many things, knight. If you want to know where she is, step into the cart." Lancelot hesitated. It was a hesitation of 2 seconds, 2 beats of a heart. In that tiny slice of time, the entirety of his life as a knight fought against the man who loved Guinevere. The code of chivalry, the pride of his name, the respect of the court, all of it screamed at him to refuse, to walk, to find another way. Then he thought of her terrified eyes. He thought of Meleagant's hands on her. Lancelot climbed into the cart. The ride was a gauntlet of shame. They passed through villages where peasants stopped their work to gawk. They passed other knights on the road who reined in their horses, staring in disbelief at the greatest champion of the age sitting amidst the straw and dung like a common criminal. They laughed, they spat, they jeered at the knight of the cart. Lancelot sat stone-faced, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He did not care. The shame burned his skin, but it was a cold fire compared to the inferno of his need to reach her. Every jeer was a penance he gladly paid. When he reached the fortress of Meleagant, he was not the shining hero of Camelot. He was a dusty, humiliated figure, stripped of his dignity. But when he drew his sword, the mockery died. Meleagant met him on the bridge. "You rode in a cart?" The renegade laughed, hefting his axe. "You debased yourself for a woman? You are no knight. I am hers," Lancelot whispered. The fight was short. Lancelot fought with a ferocity that was terrifying to behold. He was not fighting for glory. He was fighting to wash the cart's stain from his soul with Meleagant's blood. He battered the renegade's shield into splinters. He drove him back against the portcullis. And finally, he opened Meleagant's throat with a savage, backhanded cut. He found Guinevere in the tower. She stood by the window, pale and shaken. When Lancelot entered, covered in gore and road dust, she did not run to him. She looked at him with a strange, cold expression. "You hesitated," she said softly. Lancelot froze. "My lady, the dwarf told me," she said, turning away. "You hesitated before getting into the cart. For 2 seconds, you valued your pride more than my life. It was a cruelty born of her own trauma, a lash of the whip to test the depth of his devotion. Lancelot fell to his knees. "Forgive me," he choked out. "I would ride through hell in a cart of bones for you." She turned back then, her facade crumbling. She ran to him, weeping, and they embraced in the bloody solar of their enemy. But they were not alone. From the shadows of the doorway, Mordred watched. He had followed, lurking like a carrion bird. He had seen the cart. He had heard the jeers of the peasants. And now he saw the reunion. He smiled. It was a smile of pure, malicious victory. The night of the cart, Mordred whispered to himself, slipping away into the darkness. The world will know of this. They will know that Lancelot threw away his honor for the queen. The whisper is no longer a whisper, uncle. It is a scream. The secret was out. Lancelot's humiliation had proved his love more clearly than any poem or song. He had stripped himself naked before the world for her, and in doing so, he had handed Mordred the weapon he needed to kill the king. The Golden Age was not just dying. It was being strangled by the very passion that had once made it beautiful. Chapter 25. The fields of Winchester were a riot of noise and color. A carnival of violence erected overnight on the rolling green. But beneath the fluttering pennants and the blare of trumpets, a sickness festered. The air was thick with humidity and gossip. The court of Camelot had gathered to watch men bleed for sport, but the real drama was not on the lists. It was in the stands. Lancelot was not there. At least, not as himself. The greatest knight of the age had grown weary of his own fame. He was tired of knights yielding before a blow was struck, terrified of the Silver Knight. He wanted to feel the struggle again. He wanted to know if his arm was still strong, or if the rot in his soul had weakened his sword. He rode into the melee wearing plain, unpolished steel. His shield was blank, devoid of the lions of Benwick, and on his helmet, tied with a ribbon of scarlet silk, fluttered the token of a lady. It was the sleeve of Elaine of Astolat, the fair maid. She was a creature of tragic innocence who had nursed him when he was wounded on the road, falling hopelessly in love with the sad, silent warrior. Lancelot did not love her. His heart was a locked room with only one occupant. But to hide his identity, he had accepted her token, a sleeve of red velvet embroidered with pearls. It was a disguise. It was a tactic. It was a mistake. In the royal box, Queen Guinevere sat beside Arthur. Her face was a mask of porcelain calm, but her hands were shredding a silk handkerchief in her lap. She saw the unknown knight. She saw the way he moved, that terrifying, liquid grace that belonged to only one man. She knew him instantly. And then she saw the sleeve. A red haze descended over her vision. A new champion rises, Arthur mused, leaning forward, oblivious to the storm beside him. He fights like a demon. Look at him, Guinevere. He reminds me of Lancelot in his youth. He fights like a traitor, Guinevere hissed, her voice low and venomous. Arthur glanced at her, confused. "My love." "Nothing," she snapped, turning her face away. "The heat. It makes me ill." Down in the mud, Lancelot was lost in the rhythm of the fight. He battered Sir Bors aside with the flat of his blade. He unhorsed Sir Gawain with a lance thrust that cracked ribs. He was unstoppable, but he fought with a reckless abandon, taking hits he should have blocked, seeking pain as a distraction from the guilt that followed him like a shadow. He won the day. The crowd roared for the stranger knight, but when he rode to the royal box to receive the prize, he did not lift his visor. He bowed stiffly to the king, and then he looked at the queen. Guinevere met his gaze through the slats of his helm. Her eyes were not filled with love. They were filled with a cold, glittering hate. She saw the red sleeve on his helm not as a disguise, but as a declaration. She believed he had replaced her. Lancelot turned his horse and fled the field, nursing a spear wound in his side that seeped blood onto his saddle. He rode back to Astolat, collapsing into a fever dream of pain and regret. When he returned to Camelot weeks later, the wound healed but the scar fresh, he went straight to the queen's chambers. He expected anger. He expected tears. He found ice. "Get out," Guinevere said. She stood by the window, her back to him. The room was cold, the fire dead in the grate. "Guinevere," Lancelot pleaded, stepping forward. "It was a disguise. The sleeve meant nothing. I did it to hide myself." "You hid yourself from your enemies," she turned, her eyes blazing. "But you humiliated me. You wore another woman's favor before the entire court. Do you know what they whisper, Lancelot? They say the queen is old. They say her champion has found a younger, fresher flower. I do not care for their whispers." Lancelot shouted, his composure cracking. "I care only for you. I have burned my life to ash for you." "Then burn the sleeve," she screamed, throwing a goblet across the room. It struck the wall near his head, splashing wine like blood. "Burn it, or leave and never return." The shouting match echoed through the stone corridors. Servants hurried past the door, heads down, terrified. Knights in the hall below exchanged uneasy glances. The private war between the queen and her champion was spilling out, staining the very fabric of the court. Mordred, leaning against a pillar in the shadows, listened to the distant argument with a satisfied smirk. He peeled an apple with a small, sharp knife. "Listen to them," he murmured to Agravain. "The parents are fighting. The house is dividing. It is shameful," Agravain grunted. "The king must know." "Oh, he knows," Mordred chuckled darkly. "But he chooses blindness. He loves them both too much to see the knife in his back. But soon the noise will be too loud to ignore." Up in the tower, the argument ended in a tearful, desperate embrace, as it always did. But the damage was done. The trust was fractured. Guinevere's jealousy had revealed the fragility of their bond. They were not two halves of a whole. They were two drowning people clinging to each other, dragging the kingdom down with them. The tournament at Winchester had been a game, but the losers were not the men in the mud. The loser was Arthur, sitting alone on his throne, listening to the silence of a castle that was slowly turning against him. The sleeve of the maiden had unraveled the tapestry of the realm. Chapter 26. The hour was late, and the castle of Camelot groaned under the weight of the winter wind. In the king's private solar, the fire had burned down to a bed of sullen, glowing coals that offered little heat and less light. Uther Pendragon sat in his high-backed chair, staring into the embers. He looked like a man eroded by the sea. His golden hair had faded to the color of dirty straw, and the skin of his face was mapped with the deep, jagged lines of a lifetime spent holding back the dark. He was not reading the scrolls piled on his desk. He was not studying the maps of the Saxon borders. He was listening to the silence, and he was afraid. A heavy knock shattered the quiet. It was a sound of demand, not request. Before Arthur could speak, the door swung open. Sir Agravain entered first. He was a thick-set man, his face flushed with wine and righteous indignation. Behind him, moving with the silent grace of a spider, came Mordred. The younger knight wore black, as always, his pale face luminous in the gloom, his eyes fixed on the king with a look of terrifying pity. "My lord," Agravain began, his voice loud, slurring slightly. "We can no longer remain silent. The court whispers, the servants laugh, and the honor of the round table is being dragged through the muck." Arthur did not look up. He knew this moment would come. He had spent 20 years pretending he was blind, 20 years turning his head when hands brushed too long or glances lingered. He had built a fortress of denial to protect the two people he loved most in the world. "Go to bed, Agravain," Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp. "You are drunk." "I am drunk on truth," Agravain shouted, stepping forward, his hand twitching near his sword hilt. "While you sit here, dreaming of laws and God, your champion is in your bed. Lancelot du Lac lies with the queen. Tonight, every night, and you do nothing." Arthur flinched. The words were out. They hung in the air like smoke, choking and undeniable. To speak it aloud was to make it real. To speak it to the king was to demand an execution. "These are lies," Arthur whispered, though his heart hammered a traitorous rhythm against his ribs. "Lancelot is the soul of honor. Guinevere is the soul of virtue. Speak this again, and I will have your tongue." "It is not a lie, uncle." Mordred spoke from the shadows. His voice was soft, devoid of Agravain's heat, cold as a knife blade against the skin. He walked to the desk, placing his hands on the worn wood. "We do not come with rumors," Mordred said smoothly. "We come with an accusation of treason. High treason. The penalty is death. The law you wrote demands it." Arthur looked at his son, the son who was also his nephew, the living embodiment of his own sin. "The law requires proof," Arthur countered, desperate to find a loophole in the cage he had built for himself. "Without proof, this is slander." "Then let us get the proof," Mordred smiled. It was a thin, bloodless expression. "Tonight, the king goes hunting. You will ride out, ostensibly for a week. We will stay behind. If Lancelot goes to her chamber, we will take him. We will take them both." Arthur stood up. He felt dizzy. The room seemed to tilt. He looked at Agravain, seeing the hunger for violence in his eyes. He looked at Mordred, seeing the cold calculation of a chess player moving his queen. If he refused, he was a tyrant who put his favorites above the law. If he agreed, he was signing the death warrant of his wife and his best friend. "And if you are wrong?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling. "If you break down the queen's door and find her alone, if you shame the greatest knight in the world for nothing, then you may take my head," Agravain spat. "And mine," Mordred added softly. Arthur walked to the window. He looked out at the rain-lashed courtyard. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that they would not be wrong. He knew that Lancelot was likely with her now, or would be as soon as the king's banner left the gate. He was trapped. The golden age of Camelot had been built on the idea that right makes might, that the law applies to everyone, from the peasant to the king. If he broke that now, everything he had fought for Badon, the table, the peace, would be a lie. "Do it," Arthur whispered. "My lord?" Agravain asked, leaning in. Arthur turned, his eyes were dead. "I said do it. Take 12 knights. Go to the queen's door. If you find him, do what the law commands. We will catch the wolf in the trap." Agravain grinned, clapping a hand on his hilt. "Be warned," Arthur said, a sudden, fierce heat returning to his voice. "Lancelot is the greatest warrior God ever put breath into. If you go to take him, Agravain, do not expect to come back." Agravain laughed, a harsh, barking sound, and turned to leave. Mordred lingered for a moment. He looked at his father, and for a second the mask slipped, revealing a deep, festering hatred. "You built a kingdom of iron laws, father," Mordred murmured. "Don't be surprised when they crush you." The door closed. Arthur was alone. He sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. He had just authorized the destruction of his own heart. He sat in the dying light, listening to the wind howl, waiting for the screams that would surely follow. The trap was set, the hunters were loose, and the king could do nothing but wait for the end of his world. Chapter 27. The corridor outside the queen's chambers was silent, save for the breathing of 12 men. They were shadows in steel, their armor muffled with strips of cloth, their swords drawn and dull in the gloom. Sir Agravain stood at the front, his ear pressed to the heavy oak door. He could hear voices, soft, intimate whispers that confirmed the treason. He looked back at Mordred, who stood apart, unarmed, watching with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an experiment. Now Agravain hissed. He slammed his mailed fist against the wood. "Open, in the name of the king. Open, traitor." Inside, the world shattered. Guinevere gasped, clutching the sheets to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. Lancelot stood up from the edge of the bed. He was not wearing his armor. He was dressed only in a linen tunic. He had no sword. His shield hung on the far wall, useless. "They are here," Lancelot whispered, his voice calm, terrifyingly steady. "The wolves, traitor knight." Agravain roared from the other side. "Come out, Lancelot du Lac. Come out and die like a man, for you are taken in your shame." Lancelot looked at Guinevere. For a moment, the chaos outside ceased to exist. He saw only her, the woman he had loved enough to damn his soul for. He reached out and touched her cheek. His hand was warm, his touch gentle. "I will not let them touch you," he promised. He turned to the door. He had no weapon. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning for anything, a poker, a candlestick. Nothing. "Open the door." Agravain screamed, and the wood splintered as a heavy boot kicked the latch. Lancelot moved. He wrapped his cloak around his left arm, forming a makeshift shield. He walked to the door and unbarred it. It swung open. The first night, a colossal man named Sir Colgrevance lunged through the gap, sword raised for a killing blow. It was a mistake. Lancelot stepped inside the arc of the swing, moving faster than thought. He caught Colgrevance's wrist with his right hand and slammed his left forearm into the man's throat. Cartilage crunched. Colgrevance gagged, dropping his sword. Lancelot caught the blade before it hit the floor. Now Lancelot roared, his voice a primal thunder that shook the stone walls. "Come and take me." He kicked Colgrevance's body back into the corridor, knocking Agravain and 2 others off balance. Then Lancelot became the storm. He charged into the hallway. He was outnumbered 12-1. He was unarmored. It did not matter. He was Lancelot. The first stroke took Sir Gerflet in the neck, severing the jugular in a spray of bright arterial blood that painted the walls. The second stroke punched through Sir Matter's chest plate. Lancelot fought with a frenzy that was not human. He was a whirlwind of steel and fury, parrying blows that should have killed him, riposting with strikes that sheared through iron and bone. It was a massacre in a closet. The narrow corridor worked against the attackers. They could not surround him. They clogged the space, tripping over the dead, their swords clashing against the walls in their panic. Agravain, bleeding from a gash in his forehead, lunged forward, screaming hate. "Die, traitor, die." Lancelot spun, deflecting Agravain's blade, and brought his own sword down in a savage, vertical chop. It split Agravain's helm. It split his skull. The king's nephew fell without a sound. The remaining knights faltered. They looked at the pile of bodies, Agravain, Colgrevance, Gerflet, and 9 others. They looked at Lancelot, who stood panting in the center of the carnage. His white tunic was soaked red. His eyes were wild, burning with the light of a man who has accepted death and decided to take the world with him. "Who is next?" Lancelot snarled, stepping forward. The survivors broke. They turned and ran, their boots slipping in the blood that now pooled on the flagstones. Lancelot did not chase them. He turned back to the room. He stepped over the corpses of men he had once called brothers. He entered the chamber, the bloody sword hanging from his hand. Guinevere was standing by the window. She had not moved. She looked at him, at the blood that coated him like a second skin. "You must go," she whispered. "If you stay, they will bring archers. They will burn the tower." "Come with me," Lancelot pleaded, extending a bloody hand. "We can fight our way to the stables. We can be in France in 3 days." "No," she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "If I run, I admit guilt. I must stay. I must face the king. I must trust in the law. The law will kill you." Lancelot cried. "Then let it," she said, her voice breaking. "Go, Lancelot. Save yourself. If you live, there is hope. If we both die here tonight, the story ends in blood." He looked at her one last time. He wanted to scoop her up, to carry her away from this nightmare. But he knew she was right. If he tried to take her now, slowed by her weight, they would be cut down in the courtyard. "I will return," he swore. "If they touch a hair on your head, I will burn this kingdom to ash." He turned and ran. He leaped from the window, catching a vine, sliding down the rough stone of the tower into the darkness below. Guinevere was left alone in the room. The door stood open. Beyond it lay the ruin of the round table, 12 dead knights, their blood seeping under the threshold, staining the rugs. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited. She waited for the sound of boots. She waited for the king. She waited for the fire. The affair was over. The war had begun. Chapter 28. The dawn was not golden, it was gray. A suffocating blanket of low clouds that promised rain, but delivered only a damp, biting chill. In the central courtyard of Camelot, a pyre had been built. It was a monstrosity of raw timber, piled high around a single, blackened stake. The smell of oil and dry kindling was already thick in the air, masking the scent of the fear that emanated from the gathered crowd. Guinevere stood tied to the stake. She wore a simple white shift, her feet bare on the rough wood. Her hair, usually a crown of autumn fire, hung limp and tangled around her pale face. She did not weep. She did not plead. She stared out at the sea of faces, the knights, the servants, the people she had ruled for 20 years. She saw pity in some, but in most, she saw a terrible, morbid curiosity. They had come to watch the queen burn. Arthur stood on the balcony above, his hands gripping the stone rail so hard that his fingernails had turned blue. He looked down at his wife. He loved her. God, he loved her. But the law stood between them like an executioner's axe. She had been found guilty of treason. The penalty was death. To spare her would be to declare that the king was above the law, and that would destroy the kingdom just as surely as the fire would destroy her body. "Light it," Arthur whispered, the words tearing his throat. A torch was brought forward. The flames licked at the oil-soaked wood. Smoke began to curl upward, gray and choking. Then the thunder came. It was not from the sky. It was the sound of hooves on cobblestones, a frantic, galloping rhythm that shook the ground. The gates of the courtyard exploded inward, wood splintering under the impact of a charging warhorse. Lancelot du Lac had returned. He was a vision of apocalypse. His armor was not silver. It was painted black with soot and dried blood. He rode his white stallion like a demon, his greatsword, erudite, swinging in wide, devastating arcs. He did not shout a war cry. He did not offer a challenge. He simply killed. The guards at the gate fell in seconds, their spears shattered, their bodies trampled. Lancelot drove his horse into the crowd, scattering peasants and soldiers alike. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of steel and fury focused on a single point. The woman on the pyre. "Cut her down," he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. Knights rushed to stop him. Sir Segwarides and Sir Griflet lunged forward, brave men doing their duty. Lancelot cut them down without breaking stride. He was not fighting men, he was fighting obstacles. He was blind to their faces. He saw only the smoke rising around the queen's feet. Near the pyre stood two figures. They were unarmed. They wore no armor, only mourning robes of black wool. They were Gareth and Gaheris, brothers of Gawain, the youngest and most beloved of the Orkney clan. They had refused to bear arms at the execution of the queen they loved like a mother. They stood there as witnesses to the tragedy, tears streaming down their faces. Lancelot's horse reared, its hooves flashing near the flames. The smoke was thick now, stinging the eyes, blurring the world into gray shapes and orange fire. Lancelot saw movement near the stake. He saw figures blocking his path to Guinevere. He did not look. He did not check. He swung the sword. The blade, honed to a razor's edge, sheared through the air with a terrifying hiss. It struck the first figure, Gareth, in the skull, cleaving through bone and brain in an instant. The boy fell without a sound. The backswing was just as brutal. It caught Gaheris across the neck, nearly decapitating him. Lancelot did not even slow down. He did not know he had just murdered the two men who had idolized him, the boys he had knighted with his own hand. He saw only the ropes binding Guinevere. He leaped from his horse, slashed the bonds, and scooped the coughing, half-conscious queen into his arms. He vaulted back into the saddle, Guinevere clinging to his chest. He spurred the horse, turning it toward the shattered gate. "Stop him!" Arthur screamed from the balcony, his voice filled with horror. But it was too late. The guards were dead or scattered. The crowd was a stampede of panic. Lancelot rode out of Camelot, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. He had saved the queen. But as the smoke cleared in the courtyard, the true cost of his rescue was revealed. Sir Gawain walked slowly toward the pyre. He ignored the chaos around him. He ignored the king shouting orders. He walked to the two bodies lying in the mud. He looked down at the crushed skull of Gareth, the boy he had raised, the brother he loved more than his own life. He looked at the severed neck of Gaheris. He fell to his knees. He did not scream. He made a sound, a low, guttural whimper that built into a howl of such raw, animal agony that it silenced the courtyard. He touched Gareth's cold hand. He looked up at the balcony, his eyes burning with a hatred that was colder than the grave. "Arthur," Gawain roared, pointing a blood-stained finger at the king. Look at what your Lancelot has done. He has slain the unarmed. He has butchered my brothers like cattle." Arthur looked down, and his heart turned to ash. He saw the bodies. He knew instantly what this meant. The war was no longer about a stolen wife. It was no longer about abstract laws. It was about blood. Gawain stood up. He drew his sword, and for the first time in 20 years, he turned the point not toward an enemy, but toward the idea of mercy. "Hear me, king," Gawain bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "There will be no peace. I will hunt him to the ends of the earth. I will burn his lands. I will kill his kin. I will not rest until Lancelot du Lac is dead at my feet." The Golden Age was not just over. It was murdered. Lancelot's blade had cut the final thread holding the kingdom together. The rescue was a success, but the price was the soul of the realm. Peace was now impossible. The innocent blood, crying out from the cobblestones, demanded a war that would consume them all. Chapter 29. The siege of Joyous Gard was not a battle. It was a weeping wound on the face of the world. The fortress, once a symbol of Lancelot's glory, now stood black and defiant against a sky choking with the smoke of campfires. Below the walls, the army of Uther Pendragon sprawled like a wounded beast, a sea of tents battered by the unrelenting wind. For 6 months, they had sat there. 6 months of rain, 6 months of mud, 6 months of listening to Sir Gawain's scream for blood at the council table. Arthur stood on a low ridge overlooking the castle. He looked older than the stones of Stonehenge. His armor hung loose on his frame, his face gray with the exhaustion of a man fighting his own heart. He did not want this war. Every arrow fired at the walls felt like it was piercing his own chest. But Gawain was the storm that would not break. "They starve in there," Gawain rasped, stepping up beside the king. His eyes were red-rimmed, wild with grief. He had not slept properly since his brothers died. "Good. Let them eat their horses. Let them eat the rats." "Gawain," Arthur said softly, "Lancelot was your brother too." "Lancelot is a butcher." Gawain roared, spitting on the ground. "He killed Gareth unarmed. He is a rabid dog, and I will put him down." The gates of Joyous Gard groaned open. A single rider emerged. It was Lancelot. He rode his white stallion, now gaunt and gray with dust. He carried no lance. His shield was lowered. He rode to the center of the field, within bowshot of the king's lines. "Arthur." Lancelot's voice carried over the wind, cracked and desperate. "My king, I do not wish to fight you. This war is madness. I did not know it was Gareth. I did not see." Arthur took a step forward, tears stinging his eyes. He wanted to run to him. He wanted to forgive him. But Gawain grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. "Do not listen to the liar," Gawain hissed. "He seeks to charm you as he charmed your wife. Order the charge." Arthur looked at Lancelot, then at Gawain. The choice was not political, it was a tearing of the soul. "I cannot," Arthur whispered. "Then I will," Gawain shouted. He mounted his horse and kicked it into a gallop, screaming a war cry that was pure hate. "Turn and fight, traitor. Turn and die." Lancelot watched him come. He did not raise his sword. He sat there, accepting his fate. But as Gawain's lance lowered, instinct, honed by 1,000 battles, took over. Lancelot spurred his horse, dodging the strike at the last second. The two armies watched in a hushed, terrified silence. The greatest knights in the world, friends who had shared bread, wounds, and glory, circled each other in the mud. They clashed with a violence that shook the ground. Sparks flew as steel met steel. It was not the clean, noble jousting of Camelot. It was a brawl. They hacked at each other, sobbing with exertion and sorrow. "Why won't you die?" Gawain screamed, swinging his sword with both hands. "I loved them too," Lancelot cried back, parrying the blow. "Gareth was like a son to me." "You have no sons," Gawain shrieked. "You have only corpses." The duel raged for hours. The sun began to set, painting the sky in colors of bruised purple. Both men were bleeding. Both men were exhausted. Arthur could watch no more. He ordered the trumpets to sound the retreat, dragging Gawain back from the edge of madness. That night, a rider approached the camp. He bore the banner of the church. It was the Bishop of Rochester, carrying a papal bull sealed with lead. He walked into the king's tent, where Gawain was being stitched up by a terrified surgeon. The bishop looked at the carnage, then at the king. "This ends now," the bishop commanded, his voice trembling with the weight of God's authority. "The Pope demands peace. You will lift this siege, King Arthur. You will take back your queen. And you, Sir Lancelot, will leave this land. You are banished to France. If you refuse, the interdict falls, and every soul in Britain is damned." Silence filled the tent. It was the only way out. It was a reprieve, but it tasted like ash. Gawain stood up, pushing the surgeon away. "He lives," he whispered, horrified. "He is allowed to leave." "It is the will of God," Arthur said, his head bowed. The next morning, the gates opened again. Guinevere rode out. She was pale, her eyes hollow, but she held her head high. She rode past the silent armies, past the graves of the men who had died for her sin, and back to the king who was forced by law to take her back. Then Lancelot rode out. He did not look at the queen. He looked at Arthur. The two men locked eyes across the muddy field. There were no words left. There was only the crushing weight of everything they had lost. Lancelot turned his horse toward the sea. He rode away, his shoulders slumped, a man exiled from his home, his love, and his purpose. As his ship vanished over the horizon, the brotherhood of the Round Table died. The war of friends was over, but the hatred remained. Gawain watched the sea, nursing his wounds and his grudge. Arthur took his wife's hand, but it felt cold in his. They returned to a Camelot that was no longer a home, but a cage of memories. The golden age was buried in the mud of Joyous Gard, and the long, dark winter of the end had begun. Chapter 30. The English Channel was a churning expanse of gray water, whipped into a fury by the autumn gales. On the cliffs of Dover, the last of the king's ships disappeared into the mist, carrying Arthur and the flower of his army toward France. They went to hunt a brother. They went because Gawain's grief was a hunger that could not be sated by peace. Behind them, the island of Britain lay quiet, vulnerable, and dangerously exposed. In the great hall of Camelot, the throne sat empty, but not for long. Mordred stood before the high seat. He ran a pale hand over the velvet cushion, feeling the texture of power. He had waited a lifetime for this. He had been the bastard in the shadows, the nephew ignored, the son denied. He had watched Arthur build a kingdom of dreams, all the while knowing that dreams are fragile things, easily shattered by the iron reality of ambition. The king is gone, Mordred whispered to the empty room. The dragon has flown. He turned to the council. They were a motley collection of minor lords, frightened clerks, and the new breed of knights, men who had never known the glory of the Round Table, only the bitterness of the Grail quest's failure. They looked at Mordred with a mixture of fear and opportunism. "Write the letters," Mordred commanded, his voice sharp and clear. "Send riders to every corner of the realm. Tell them the king is dead." A gasp rippled through the room. A clerk dropped his quill. "My lord," he stammered, "but we have no word. I am the word," Mordred roared, slamming his hand onto the table. "Arthur has fallen in France, slain by the traitor Lancelot. The army is scattered. I am the regent. I am the heir. I am the king." The lie was bold. It was monstrous. But in a world starving for certainty, it was swallowed whole. The news spread like a plague. Bells tolled in the villages. Peasants wept in the fields. The great king was dead. Long live King Mordred. Mordred did not waste time mourning the father he had just erased. He moved with the ruthless efficiency of a man who knows his time is short. He opened the treasury, buying the loyalty of the Saxon mercenaries with Arthur's gold. He promised land to the disaffected lords. He dismantled the laws of the Round Table, replacing the code of chivalry with the law of the strong. But one symbol remained to be claimed, one piece of the puzzle to legitimize his theft. Guinevere. She was in the Tower of London, having fled Camelot when the first whispers of Mordred's coup reached her. She knew him. She had seen the snake behind his eyes for years. When Mordred's army surrounded the tower, she stood on the battlements, looking down at the sea of black banners. "Open the gates," Mordred shouted from below, mounted on a black charger. "I come to offer you protection, my queen. You come to offer me a cage." Guinevere called back, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her heart. "I know you, Mordred. I know what you are." "Arthur is dead, Guinevere." Mordred lied, his voice dripping with false sorrow. "You are a widow in a dangerous land. Marry me. Unite our claims. Let us rule together." The audacity of it took her breath away. To marry his father's wife, to commit incest upon incest, it was not just a political move, it was a desecration. It was Mordred spitting in the face of God and Arthur simultaneously. "I would sooner marry a corpse," she screamed. "You are a monster, a viper bred in the dark." Mordred's face hardened. The mask of the benevolent protector slipped, revealing the tyrant beneath. "Then starve," he hissed. "I will seal this tower. No food goes in, no water. When you are eating the leather of your shoes, you will beg to be my wife." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving the queen trapped in the stone silence of the fortress. Britain descended into chaos. The order Arthur had spent decades building evaporated in weeks. The roads became slaughterhouses. Neighbors turned on neighbors. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak died in the mud. The Golden Age was a distant memory, replaced by the Age of the Wolf. Mordred sat on Arthur's throne, wearing Arthur's crown. It was heavy, hurting his brow, but he did not care. He had won. He had taken everything. But as he looked out over the darkened hall, he felt a cold draft on his neck. He knew, deep in his black heart, that the lie could not hold forever. The dead do not always stay dead. The once and future king was not a title given lightly. Across the sea, the wind was changing, and the dragon was turning home. Chapter 31. The cliffs of Dover were not white that morning. They were hidden behind a curtain of gray rain and sea spray, looming over the beach like the walls of a tomb. The tide was coming in, churning the shingle into a treacherous slurry of stones and foam. Out in the bay, the fleet of King Arthur bobbed on the swells. They were tired ships, carrying tired men. They had not come as conquerors. They had come as desperate exiles returning to a home that had been stolen. On the beach, Mordred's army waited. They were a dark stain on the pale stones, thousands of men, archers, and heavy infantry, their armor slick with rain. They did not cheer. They did not bang their shields. They waited with the grim silence of executioners. "Signal the landing," Arthur commanded from the deck of his flagship. His voice was raw, stripped of its old power. He wore his armor, but it felt heavy, a burden rather than a protection. The boats hit the surf. It was a massacre. The moment the ramps dropped, the air was filled with the hiss of arrows. It was not a battle, it was a butchery. Men jumped into the freezing water, weighed down by mail, and were cut down before they could find their footing. The sea turned red, a blooming crimson cloud that mixed with the gray foam. Sir Gawain was in the first boat. He was a man possessed, fueled by a rage that had burned for months. He leaped onto the shingle, his sword swinging, screaming defiance at the traitors. He cut down 3 men in as many seconds, clearing a beachhead with sheer, brute violence. But he was not the man he used to be. The wound in his skull, the legacy of his duel with Lancelot in France, had never truly healed. It throbbed with every beat of his heart, a constant, blinding pain. As he raised his shield to block a blow from a Saxon axe, his vision swam. He stumbled. The axe descended, not on his shield, but on the old wound. There was a sound like a cracking egg. Gawain fell. The battle raged around him, a chaotic swirl of screaming men and dying horses. But for Gawain, the world narrowed to the gray sky and the cold stones pressing into his back. He felt the life leaking out of him, warm and wet. Arthur found him hours later. The beach was secured, Mordred's forces having retreated inland, but the victory felt like ashes in the mouth. The shoreline was littered with the dead, their bodies rolling in the surf. The king knelt in the bloody shingle. He took Gawain's hand. It was cold. "Gawain," Arthur whispered, tears carving tracks through the salt and grime on his face. "Do not leave me, not you too." Gawain opened his eyes. They were clear now, the madness of his grief finally washed away by the clarity of death. "Uncle," Gawain rasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "It is the old wound, Lancelot." He struck true. "Do not speak of him," Arthur said, gripping the hand tighter. "No," Gawain squeezed back, finding a final reserve of strength. "I must. I was wrong, Arthur. My pride, my anger, it has killed us all. I drove him away. I broke the brotherhood. Gawain, please." "Write to him," Gawain insisted, his voice fading. "I cannot. My hands are useless. Write to him. Tell him I forgive him. Tell him to come back. You need him, Arthur. You cannot win this alone. Lancelot. He is the only sword that can save you now." Arthur nodded, sobbing openly. "I will tell him." "Good," Gawain smiled, a faint, ghostly expression. "Now, I go to see my brothers. I hope they will let me in." The light faded from his eyes. The hand went limp. Arthur sat on the beach for a long time. The tide began to go out, pulling the red water away from the land. He was alone, truly alone. Merlin was gone. Guinevere was imprisoned. Lancelot was exiled. And now Gawain, the last pillar of his old life, lay dead at his feet. He looked up at the cliffs. Somewhere beyond them, Mordred was waiting. The boy he had tried to kill, the son he had tried to ignore, the sin he had tried to bury. Fate had circled all the way around. The golden age was a dream. The round table was a memory. There was only the king, the traitor, and the end of the world. Arthur stood up. He unbuckled Excalibur from his hip, holding the sheathed weapon in his hand. It felt light, terrifyingly so. "Bury him," Arthur ordered the silent soldiers standing nearby. "Bury him facing the sea. Let him watch for Lancelot." He turned his back on the ocean and began the march inland. The final apocalypse had begun. Chapter 32. The plain of Camlann was a desolate expanse of scrub and flint, a scar on the landscape where nothing grew but nettles and the bitter wind. It was here, on the edge of the world, that the two armies had come to rest. To the west lay the ragged tents of Arthur's host, the last loyalists of a dying age. To the east, the sprawling encampment of Mordred, a hive of mercenaries, traitors, and opportunists. Between them lay a strip of no man's land, silent and frosted with the cold dew of impending winter. Arthur sat in his pavilion, but he did not sleep. The air in the tent was stale, smelling of old leather, and the unwashed bodies of his guards. He stared at the single candle flame, watching it dance and sputter. When he closed his eyes, the darkness was not empty. It was filled with the sound of hissing. He had dreamed. It was a vision of terrifying clarity. He saw himself strapped to a great wheel, the wheel of fortune, suspended over a black abyss. At the bottom of the pit, a sea of serpents writhed, creatures of slime and scale, their fangs dripping with venom. As the wheel turned, he was plunged into the mass. He felt their cold bodies coiling around his limbs, their teeth sinking into his flesh. He woke with a scream caught in his throat, sweat soaking his tunic. "My lord." Sir Bedivere stepped into the light, his face gaunt with worry. He was one of the few left. The circle had shrunk to this, a handful of old men and frightened boys. "The dream, Bedivere," Arthur whispered, rubbing his face. "It warns of ruin. If we fight tomorrow, we all die. The wheel has turned. My luck is spent. Mordred has the numbers," Bedivere admitted, his voice low. "But his men fight for gold. Ours fight for you." "Dead men cannot fight for anyone," Arthur said, standing up. He picked up Excalibur. The sword felt heavy, a burden he was tired of carrying. "I will not lead these boys to the slaughter. I must try. One last time." He ordered the heralds to sound the parley. They met in the center of the field as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. It was a gray dawn, the light filtering through heavy, leaden clouds. Arthur rode out with Bedivere and Lucan the butler. Mordred rode out with two of his captains. They stopped 10 paces apart. Mordred looked magnificent in his stolen glory. He wore black armor etched with silver, a cloak of raven feathers draped over his shoulders. His face was pale, his eyes bright with a manic energy. He looked at his father not with hatred, but with a cold, triumphant pity. "You look tired, Uncle," Mordred smiled, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "The crown weighs heavy, does it not? Give it to me. Go to a monastery. Pray for your sins. I will be a benevolent king." "You will be a tyrant," Arthur replied, his voice steady. "You have already poisoned the land with your ambition, but I did not come to trade insults. I came to trade lives." Arthur offered terms. He offered Mordred the lands of Kent and Cornwall. He offered him succession to the throne upon Arthur's natural death. It was a generous offer, a desperate offer. It was the King of Britain begging his bastard son to stop the bleeding. Mordred listened, his head cocked to the side like a bird of prey. He saw the desperation in Arthur's eyes. He saw the fear, and it pleased him. "Kent and Cornwall," Mordred mused, "and the crown when you die? It is a good offer. Better than you deserve. Take it," Arthur urged. "Let these men go home to their wives. Do not stain this field with more British blood." Mordred hesitated. He looked back at his army. He knew his hold on them was fragile. If he could win the kingdom without a fight, it would solidify his rule. "Agreed," Mordred said, "but on one condition. You disband your army first." "We disband together," Arthur countered. "Very well." The tension in the air was a physical thing, a wire pulled so tight it hummed. The two leaders signaled their armies. The men began to lower their spears. A collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the ranks. It was going to happen. Peace. A fragile, ugly peace, but peace nonetheless. Then fate laughed. A knight on the edge of the parley, one of Mordred's mercenaries, felt a sharp sting on his ankle. He looked down. An adder, roused from its winter sleep by the trampling hooves, had bitten through his boot. It was instinct. It was reflex. The knight did not think. He drew his sword to kill the snake. The flash of steel in the gray light was like a signal fire. "Treason," roared a voice from Arthur's lines. "They attack," screamed a voice from Mordred's. The wire snapped. There was no time to explain. No time to shout stop. The fear that had been coiled in the gut of every man on that field exploded. Arrows flew. Trumpets blared. The parley dissolved into chaos. Arthur looked at Mordred. For a split second, they shared a look of absolute horror. They both knew what had happened. They both knew it was an accident, but it didn't matter. The wheel had turned. The serpents were waiting. "So be it," Mordred screamed, drawing his own sword, his face twisting into a mask of hate. "Die then, old man." Arthur wheeled his horse around, galloping back toward his lines as the air filled with the hiss of death. The peace was dead. The negotiations were dust. The Battle of Camlann had begun, started not by the grand ambition of kings, but by the bite of a single, small snake in the grass. The tragedy was perfect. The end was here. Chapter 33. The sun had been swallowed by the smoke. The day had turned into a twilight of ash and iron. Camlann was no longer a field, it was a charnel house. It had begun with a snake, a single flash of steel, and it had descended instantly into madness. There were no formations here, no shield walls, no cavalry charges led by banners snapping in the wind. The mud was too deep, the hatred too raw. It was a brawl of 100,000 men, a grinding, screaming mass of humanity hacking at itself, until there was nothing left to kill. Arthur fought on foot. His horse, Lamray, lay dead somewhere in the mire, its white coat stained black. The king was a figure of grim, mechanical destruction. He was covered in mud and blood, some his own, most belonging to the men he had once sworn to protect. Excalibur was heavy in his hand, no longer a singing blade of light, but a butcher's tool, dulling with every blow against bone and helm. He saw Sir Lucan go down, pulled into the muck by 3 Saxon mercenaries who tore at him like dogs. He saw men he had feasted with, men whose children he had named, driving daggers into each other's eyes. The Round Table was not dying, it was committing suicide. The noise was a physical assault, the wet thud of axes, the snap of breaking spears, the gurgling cries of the drowning and the dying. The ground became a slurry of gore, slippery and treacherous. Men fell and did not rise, trampled into the earth by their comrades. Arthur moved through the chaos like a ghost. He was looking for one face in the sea of violence. Hours passed. The screaming began to fade, replaced by a silence that was infinitely worse. It was the silence of extinction. As the gray light of evening crept over the battlefield, the fighting stopped, not because of a truce, but because there was no one left to fight. The field was carpeted with bodies, a harvest of death that stretched as far as the eye could see. The crows were already descending, black flakes of ash settling on the feast. Arthur leaned against a broken wagon wheel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked around. Only 2 men stood with him. Sir Bedivere, clutching a wound in his side, and Sir Lucan, who had miraculously risen from the mud, though his face was a mask of pain. "My lord," Bedivere whispered, his voice sounding thin in the heavy air. "It is over. We are the last." Arthur wiped the blood from his eyes. He scanned the horizon. "Not the last," he rasped. "Where is he?" Then he saw him. Across the field, standing atop a mound of corpses, was Mordred. He was alone. His black armor was battered, his cloak torn to shreds, but he stood tall, leaning on his blood-soaked sword. He looked at Arthur across the distance of death. He did not look afraid. He looked satisfied. He had burned the world down, and now he was the king of the ashes. "Do not go to him, Lord," Lucan pleaded, grabbing Arthur's arm. "Let him be. The day is done. You have won the field by living, if you fight him now. The dream warned you." "The dream is already true, Lucan," Arthur said, shaking off the hand. He gripped Excalibur. The blade seemed to hum, a low, mournful note of finality. "I have nothing left to lose. My kingdom is dead. My knights are dead. My wife is a prisoner. My best friend is in exile. There is only this. There is only the end. He is waiting for you," Bedivere warned. "He is a viper, Arthur. Do not walk into his bite." "I made him," Arthur whispered, his eyes fixed on the dark figure in the distance. "I made him with my sin. I made him with my neglect. It is right that I unmake him." Arthur began to walk. He stepped over the bodies of friends and foes, his boots sinking into the soft, red earth. He did not run. He walked with the heavy, inevitable tread of fate itself. Mordred watched him come. He smiled, a flash of white teeth in a face smeared with soot. He raised his sword, a gesture of welcome. "Come, father," Mordred called out, his voice cracking with exhaustion and madness. "Come and hug your son." Arthur did not speak. He did not shout. He simply kept walking, closing the distance, step by agonizing step. The wind picked up, howling through the heap of the dead, sounding like the lament of 1,000 lost souls. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into shadow. The stage was set. The audience was a field of corpses. The final act of the tragedy was about to begin. Chapter 34. The distance between the father and the son was measured in heartbeats, each one a drum in the silence of the dead field. Arthur gripped the shaft of his spear, his knuckles white, his hands slick with the blood of men he had once called friends. Mordred stood waiting, his sword raised, his face a mask of pale, grinning madness. "Die, Arthur roared, a sound that tore through his ruined throat. He did not fence, he lunged. He put the entire weight of his broken kingdom behind the thrust. The spear struck true. It punched through the black steel of Mordred's breastplate with a sickening crunch of metal and bone. The point exited the boy's back, slick and red. The force of the blow should have knocked him backward, should have ended him instantly. But Mordred did not fall. He looked down at the ashwood shaft burying itself in his chest. He gasped, a wet, rattling sound, and then he looked up at the king. His eyes were not filled with fear. They were filled with a hatred so pure it defied death. Mordred dropped his shield. He reached out with both hands and gripped the spear that was killing him. Arthur froze, horror flooding his veins. With a scream of agony that sounded like tearing metal, Mordred pulled himself forward. He slid his own body up the spear, the wood grinding against his shattered ribs, the blood pouring from his mouth. He forced himself deeper onto the weapon just to get within striking distance of his father. "Father," Mordred gurgled, blood spraying Arthur's face. He swung his sword. It was a clumsy, desperate blow, fueled by the last sparks of his life. The blade crashed into the side of Arthur's helm. It sliced through the steel and bit deep into the bone of the king's skull. Arthur fell. The world turned sideways, gray and spinning. Mordred collapsed atop him, a heavy, dead weight, the spear still pinning them together in a grotesque embrace. The usurper was dead, his eyes open and staring at nothing. The king was dying. Sir Bedivere was there in an instant, weeping, dragging the corpse of the son off the body of the father. He pulled Arthur to the edge of the water, away from the stench of the slaughter. "My lord," Bedivere sobbed, cradling Arthur's head. "Hold on. The surgeons we will find." "Silence," Arthur whispered. His voice was a ghost. The wound in his head was fatal. He could feel the cold creeping into his limbs, numbing the pain. "There is no healing for this. The wheel has turned full circle." Arthur's hand fumbled at his belt. He unbuckled the scabbard that would have saved him had he not lost it years ago, and drew Excalibur. The blade was still bright, the only clean thing in the entire world. It hummed with a low, mournful vibration. "Take it," Arthur commanded, pressing the hilt into Bedivere's hand. "This was never mine. It was alone. Go to the water, throw it in." "My king, I cannot," Bedivere stammered, looking at the magnificent weapon. "It is the symbol of Britain. If I throw it away, the memory of the Golden Age dies with it." "The Golden Age is already dead," Arthur wheezed, his eyes fluttering. "Do as I command." "One last time, Bedivere. Obey your king." Bedivere ran. He scrambled over the dunes to the edge of the dark lake. He looked at the sword, then at the water. He hesitated, but the memory of Arthur's dying eyes burned into him. He swung his arm and hurled the blade with all his strength. Excalibur spun through the twilight, end over end, a wheel of steel and diamond. It did not hit the water. The surface of the lake broke. An arm, clothed in white samite, rose from the depths. It was the same arm that had offered the blade a lifetime ago, when the world was young and full of hope. The hand caught the hilt with a solid, echoing smack. It brandished the weapon 3 times, a salute, or perhaps a farewell, and then slowly sank back beneath the black surface. The water smoothed over. The magic had left the world. Bedivere returned to the king. "It is done," he wept. "Good," Arthur breathed. "Now, help me to the shore." Bedivere half carried, half dragged the broken king to the water's edge. As they arrived, a shape materialized out of the mist. It was a barge, painted black as midnight, drifting without oars or sails. On the deck stood 3 women dressed in mourning hoods. One of them stepped forward. She lowered her hood, revealing a face that was severe, beautiful, and lined with age. It was Morgan Le Fay. The enemy, the sister, the blood. She did not speak. She simply reached out. Bedivere surrendered his king to her. The women lifted Arthur as if he weighed nothing, laying him gently on the deck. Morgan sat, placing Arthur's bleeding head in her lap. She brushed the matted hair from his forehead with a tenderness that had been missing for 40 years. "The wound is deep, my brother," she whispered, her voice like the wind in dry grass. "It is deep enough," Arthur replied, his eyes fixing on the stars that were beginning to pierce the gloom. "Where do we go?" "To Avalon," Morgan said. "To the place of apples, to the place of healing. You have earned your rest." The barge began to move, pulling away from the shore, drifting into the thickening fog. Bedivere stood on the blood-soaked sand, watching them go. He wanted to call out, to beg them to take him too, but his voice failed him. He watched until the black shape was swallowed by the gray mist. He listened, straining his ears for a sound, a horn, a voice, a sign that the king lived. There was only silence. The wind died. The waves lapped gently against the shore, washing the blood from the stones. The story was over. The swords were broken, the castle was empty, and the knights were dead. But in the quiet of the night, a new feeling settled over the land. It was not hope, exactly, but a promise. A whisper in the earth that said the story was a circle. That the king was gone, but the king would return. Bedivere turned his back on the sea and began the long walk into the dark, carrying nothing but the memory of a dream that had once been Camelot. The once and future king had passed into legend, and the world was left to wait for the turning of the wheel. From the moment young Arthur drew the sword from the stone to his final departure for the shores of Avalon, we have witnessed the rise and fall of a legend that defines the very soul of chivalry and the enduring hope of a kingdom that lives on in our hearts. If you could have stood among the glorious fellowship of Camelot, which of the legendary knights would you have chosen to ride beside on a quest for the Holy Grail? Let us know your choice in the comments section below. Your engagement helps our fire stay bright. So please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hype this video so we can continue to bring more of these timeless stories to life. We hope you journey back soon to the Midnight Oasis. Thank you.